Chapter 3685. The furious Luina was not caught by Li Shanli this time. Her last bit of rationality had been triggered by Li Shanli's words and vanished into thin air. There was only one thought in her mind. She wanted the Chinese students who had humiliated the Korean soldiers to pay the price. She did the craziest thing in her anger, completely pushing the Korean students into the teeth of the storm. Stop! Stop your stupid actions immediately. This was the angry roar of the referee. They were here, but the Korean students still dare to do this. Did they treat this serious competition as a game? Was it a game where they could play as they pleased and not as they pleased? The Korean students were the most flustered. They did not expect Luina to be so impatient and directly stab Tianqin. Her actions were enough for the arbitration committee to disqualify Korea. Tianqin seemed to be frightened. Her eyes were wide open and she stood still. She was really frightened. She drew her knife just because of a disagreement? How was this amazing? His brain must have been flooded with water. The two siblings, Yi Jian and Li Jinyan, had guessed correctly that Luina would be the most intolerable. They had also guessed if she would make a move, but they really hadn't expected that. This girl would draw her sword and meet them head-on. There was no need for her to do anything else. Just her current behavior was enough to disqualify Korea from the competition. The referee, who was shouting loudly, had already rushed over. He was also shocked by the scene in front of him. She actually dared to attack with a knife in front of the referee. That's right, Luina was committing murder at this moment. She, who was committing murder, had frightened everyone. Li Shanli, who did not manage to hold on to her, let out a desperate and hateful cry. Luina did not only harm herself, she also implicated all the Korean students. She would make all the Korean students lose the courage to return to their country. The Korean students who ran over could not stop Luina, who was crazily stabbing Tianqin. They could only watch the scene unfold in front of them, but they could not do anything to stop it. Luina, stop right there. The instructor had already seen the golden bell turn black. He also knew what kind of storm was coming for Korea. It's over, it's over, it's over. Yi Qian, who had already noticed Luina approaching them, saw this. The moment Luina pounced on them, she quickly pulled the frightened Tianqin behind her. At the same time, she quickly grabbed Luina's wrist that was holding the knife. Then she turned around and hooked Luina's leg with her leg. Amidst the Korean scholar's screams, she threw Luina over her shoulder. This shoulder throw was a bit like holding a rag doll and smashing it hard on the ground. Luina immediately let out a scream when she hit the ground. Yi Qian had long wanted to communicate with Luina, but he never had the chance. Now that the opportunity was in his hands, how could he miss it? During the shoulder throw, Yi Qian did a little trick. He did not let Luina directly hit the ground with her back. Instead, he let her hit the ground with her shoulder first. This way of hitting the ground was more ruthless and lethal than hitting the ground with her back. At this moment, Luina was in so much pain that she felt as if her right shoulder had been smashed to the ground. The scream that came out of her throat was not any softer than that of Park Hai-sun. Park Hai-sun was luckier than Luina. Yi Qian kicked him and did not make any further moves. Luina was different. After being thrown over her shoulder, she was leaped into the air by Yi Qian. Her entire body was straddled by Yi Qian. Her hands were tightly clasped behind her back, and her head was pressed into the uneven grass by Yi Qian. Chapter 3686. How could Luina have a chance to struggle free? All she could do was scream. Yi Qian, who was slightly bent over her head, said softly, "Luina, you are destined not to win against me, just like how your students are destined not to win against our Chinese students. It's the same for your country. No soldier could stand their country being insulted by another country's soldier. As a soldier, Yi Qian couldn't stand it either. She had tolerated Luina from yesterday until tonight. Now, it was time for Luina to pay the price for her inappropriate behavior. Even though Luina heard everything clearly, she did not have the chance to speak. Her face was deformed by Yi Jian's pressure. Her nose, eyes, and mouth were all squeezed flat. She could not even open her mouth. Even her screams could only be heard in her throat, making muffled noises. Two referees holding walkie-talkies rushed over. One of the referees asked Tianqin if she was all right. Tianqin, who still had lingering fear on her face, shook her head, indicating that she was fine. Then, she quickly said, "My comrade needs your help. I don't know if she's injured." The other referee came over and pressed Lu in his shoulder. At the same time, he said to Yiqian, "Good job. You've prevented a tragedy from happening." If a Chinese student had been stabbed by a Korean student, it wouldn't have been a small matter. Yiqian, who was praised, pressed his lips together and answered the referee with silence. She didn't want praise. She wanted Korea to lose the right to compete. Jin Zhong, who had staggered all the way here, closed his eyes in pain when he saw his own student being pressed down like a criminal. His heart ached for his student. However, his heartache didn't have any effect. The referee had no intention of letting Luena go. Instead, he warned him sternly, "From now on, you and your student are not allowed to come close." Luena, whose shoulder was in great pain, kicked her legs even harder when she heard this. She kept making muffled sound from her throat. At this time, Luena didn't feel that she had done anything wrong. The anger in her eyes was about to spew out. Jin Zhong saw that the situation wasn't good. He turned around and looked for Li Jinyan. "Your student has seriously violated the rules of the competition. Forgive me for not being able to help. Moreover, my country's students were almost stabbed by your country's students. I need to be responsible for the safety of my country's students, and you also need to be responsible for the impulsiveness of your country's students." Li Jinyan's cold voice shattered Jin Zhong's last hope in the instructor's heart. Jin Zhong's shoulders drooped instantly, and even his back seemed to bend a lot. Li Jinyan led the Chinese students past instructor Jin Zhong's eye and headed towards Yiqian. The Chinese students despised the Korean students for being narrow-minded and narrow-minded. So this is how the Korean military school students are like. My knowledge has been broadened. Monfei's military had already received the report from the front. The faces of several high-ranking officials in charge changed greatly on the spot. There was actually such a thing happening. The news quickly spread, and the instructors of the various countries were all shocked when they found out. If he lost, he lost. How dare he use a knife to commit murder after losing? This was absolutely intolerable. The instructors of the United States, Russia, Britain, Germany, and Thailand came with the senior generals of the Monfei military. At the same time, there were several soldiers with live ammunition. The soldiers came to control Luena. If they came over, Yiqian would have nothing to do with them. Chapter 3687. Luena was handed over to the Monfei soldiers. The strong and powerful Monfei soldiers grabbed Luena's shoulders from both sides and lifted her feet off the ground as if they were lifting a chicken. Luena, who had never been treated like this before, was so angry that her eyes turned red. Her right shoulder was very painful, which made her even more furious. "I want to complain about your inhumane treatment. I want to complain about you." Hearing this, the senior Monfei military officer waved his hand and signaled the soldiers to take Luena further away. Two soldiers received the order and lifted Luena, who was bouncing in the air, to the side. Just before this incident happened, we were still discussing with the arbitration committee what kind of punishment to give to your country's students. Although the Chinese instructor said that you were communicating, we found that this was not the case after watching the surveillance footage. Your students have seriously violated the rules of the competition and at the same time disrupted the discipline of the competition. This is not something a soldier can do, but your country's students did it, which shocked us. Instructor Kim, we are very sorry. At the same time, we don't need to think about it anymore. I now announce on behalf of the arbitration committee that Korea is disqualified from the competition. Instructor Kim, please bring your students back to the camp immediately, pack your luggage, and leave this place. We have already arranged for a car to leave the camp. Our soldiers will send you to the airport. As for your student who is still shouting loudly, she has the right to complain. We welcome her complaints. Now, please gather all the students from your country. I will let the soldiers escort you to the car. As for the female student, for the safety of the Chinese students, Our soldiers will personally send her to the car until she leaves here." Without giving instructor Kim Jong-jae a chance to speak, the Monfei military officer had already made everything clear. Instructor Kim Jong-jae was so anxious that his forehead was about to break out in sweat. "No, this is really a misunderstanding. I hope. No, this is not a misunderstanding. You know it yourself, and we also know it. This is a very bad incident. We have to eliminate the possibility of it happening again. We will not allow such students to appear in the competition. You have no chance to explain. Please take your students and leave immediately." The faces of the Korean students were deathly pale. Their eyes were filled with darkness. Disqualification. They were disqualified. They were disqualified. They were disqualified. Instructor Jin Jong still wanted to say a few more words for his students, but the instructors of the 5 countries who came with him also spoke up. The American instructor said with a sullen face, "We don't want to see such a thing happen again. Your behavior makes us deeply worried, so we support the decision of the arbitration committee. Yes, this is a very correct decision. You have no right to change it." Look at that female cadet's voice. Even now, she still doesn't think she's wrong. This is not a misunderstanding. This is your cadet's failure. She is an unqualified cadet and will also be an unqualified soldier. Compared to the cadets of the Chinese side, she is far too inferior. The words of the instructor from the 5 countries were like sharp needles that pierced into the Korean students and instructor Kim Jong-jae. They were so pierced that their bodies were on the verge of collapsing. They no longer had the arrogance they had before. Chapter 3688. Without that layer of bright feathers adorned with self-righteous arrogance, one by one, they turned from proud peacocks to defeated fighting cocks, no longer having the arrogance from before. Jin Jong, who was lecturing, was stung by the ruthless words of the instructors from the 5 countries. He covered his chest with his hand. The unqualified military school students, the unqualified soldiers, were far inferior to the Chinese military school students. Their persistence was crushed into powder at this moment, and their international image also fell from the clouds to the mud at this moment. On the other hand, the Chinese cadets were skyrocketing and were praised by the instructors of the other countries. All the explanations were pale and powerless. No one would listen to the explanations of the Korean instructor, Jin Jae. Even if he explained, no one would listen. Luina still insisted that they were not wrong. Based on this alone, even if Jin Jae spat out blood in front of the instructor, no one would believe his words. At this moment, the Korean cadets had lost face and lost everything, causing the international image of their cadets to plummet. No one knew how much effort they would have to put in to win back their lost face. The dispirited instructor Jin Jae finally gave up explaining, because he knew very well that at this moment, any explanation would have no effect at all. In order to maintain the last strength of their country's soldiers, Instructor Jin Jae saluted the instructors of the 5 countries and the senior general of the Monfei military and solemnly apologized. "I am very sorry to have caused you so much trouble. We will definitely remember the criticism and will not let something like this happen again. Good luck to all of you. Goodbye." The qualification for the competition had been revoked, and there was no possibility of changing it. Since the Monfei military had arranged a vehicle to send them away, they might as well leave as soon as possible. The senior general of the Monfei military returned the salute, and his serious expression did not relax at all. He reminded, "If something like this happens again, I think your cadets will not be able to receive invitations from international competitions for a long time. I also believe that your country's cadets are not all like that female cadet who is still making a fuss. However, I can see one problem. Your country's selection criteria for outstanding cadets are too lenient, which is why that female cadet was able to join." With Jin Jong around, what else could the instructor say? At this moment, he had to thank the senior military officer of Monfei for not killing all the military academy students with a stick. All the military academy students were like Luina. He did not stay any longer and strode towards his own students. He had to leave with his students. Monfei's high-ranking military officer turned to the Chinese instructor, Li Jingyan, and apologized for what the Korean students had done. He also praised the performance of the Chinese students. Li Jinyan's expression was still cold, even though the senior general of Monfei had taken the lead. He didn't feel happy because of the praise. He just said, "We just follow the rules of every competition. We always remember that soldiers should obey orders. So, what happened tonight is nothing to us. The Chinese soldiers are amazing. They showed us their steel-like discipline." Monfei's high-ranking military officers all gave him a thumbs up, but their gazes towards the Chinese students were a little gloomy. The Chinese students were many times more powerful than they had imagined. They had thought that the Chinese students were nothing to be afraid of. Even if they came, they would be at the bottom. Who would have thought that they would squeeze past the military school students of countless countries and directly enter the top 5? Today, they were even firmly in 3rd place. From this, it could be seen that the Chinese students' plan was to secure the top 5. Chapter 3689. There were still a few days of competition left, and it was a good opportunity for them to see how strong the Chinese military academy students were. The Korean students who were disqualified from the competition had already been removed from the minds of the Monfei military officers. One was treating them seriously, while the other was treating them apologetically. The difference in treatment made the Korean students who had not left feel as if they had taken off all their clothes and were standing there naked, surrounded by everyone. This matter would become a memory they would never want to remember in their lives. When they saw their instructor walking over with a straight face, they all felt very guilty and slightly averted their gazes, no longer looking directly at him. They wanted the Chinese side to apologize, but now they were disqualified from the competition and were about to return home with great shame. How would they face it when they returned home? The group of young military academy students from Korea were both panicked and confused. "You heard it just now. You are disqualified from the competition. Go back to the camp now and pack your bags. We will return home tonight." Jin Zhong was there. The instructor did not reprimand the students immediately. He needed to calm down. He was afraid that he would not be able to control his anger. It would not be too late to reprimand them after he calmed down. What was done was done. There was no turning back. Those who should be punished would be punished, and those who should be scolded would be scolded. He had to deal with this matter properly. The students were in the wrong, and so was he. If he had not told the students that the Chinese side was weak, then the students from their country would not have looked down on the Chinese side. They would not have been crushed by the Chinese side today and finally made an irreparable mistake. First, he had to reflect on himself. Li Shanli's lips were trembling, and his eyes were filled with tears. He asked in a very soft voice, "What kind of punishment will we receive when we return home? Can you tell us now? Would Luina be punished? Would she escape punishment because of her father? Would they have to bear the consequences of their mistakes? The Chinese side does not know about our situation. I don't know what punishment we will receive when we return home. I am also in the wrong. Let's leave here first. We will talk about it when we return home." Jin Zhong saw the fear in the student's eyes. The anger in his heart was like a raging fire dragon. He took a few deep breaths and suppressed his anger. "Line up." The Chinese students watched as the Korean students lined up and left the competition venue. Luina, who was separated by 2 Monfei soldiers, did not participate in the entire process. She was controlled by the Monfei soldiers the whole time and left the competition venue. Luina still didn't know that they had been disqualified from the competition. She was a little far away just now, so she didn't hear what the senior military officers of Monfei and the instructors of the 5 countries said. She was still protesting while being carried away. Jin Zhong, who had been ignoring her, was angered by her stupid behavior. Unable to bear it any longer, he roared, "Luina, stop your stupid behavior. Do you have any idea what your foolish actions have done to us?" Even the Korean students were disqualified from the competition. Luina was dumbfounded. She was disqualified? They were disqualified from the competition. Luina couldn't accept it for a while. She only regained her senses when she was about to board the truck to the campsite. When she regained her senses, she asked, "That's impossible. This was impossible. What right do you have to disqualify us? What about China? Have they been canceled?" Chapter 3690. Her question made the faces of the Korean students even stiffer as if they had been splashed with a layer of cement. At this moment, all their expressions had turned into lifeless blocks of cement. China didn't. Only we were disqualified. Chairman Jun answered her, his voice full of fatigue. He did not vent his anger on Lu Enna. From the beginning, he was also involved. How could he vent his anger on a person? The male students were relatively calmer. In the face of Lu Enna's question, although they were angry at Lu Enna's behavior of disgracing their country, they only glanced at her with cold eyes and did not say anything. At this point, they had all been disqualified and expelled from the Monfei military camp overnight. Did she still think that they were fine? Did she think it was a joke? Where's her brain? Where did her brain go? Instructor Jin Zhongzai did not want to have any communication with Lu Enna anymore. He was afraid that he could not control himself and accidentally choked the commander's daughter to death. Then he would apologize with his death. Before they arrived at the barracks, another message came. The Korean students only had 15 minutes to pack their luggage and must leave the Monfei military camp within 15 minutes. They could not stay for a second longer. Without a doubt, another vicious slap was thrown over. This was a great humiliation for Lu Enna. Her whole face was pulled long, and there was no difference between her and a donkey's face. She was so angry that her chest heaved violently. She did not have a chance to be with the Korean students and instructors. She was listed as a dangerous person and was directly taken away by the Monfei soldiers and sat alone in a truck. Seeing this, the Korean students who had already boarded the truck pursed their lips tightly. They almost covered their faces. Shameful, really shameful. However, Lu Enna herself did not realize it. Li Shanli, who had not yet boarded the truck, walked to Lu Enna, who was still held by two Monfei soldiers, and said with a painful expression, "Enna, you made all of us disqualified. Why don't you realize what you did wrong? Do you know what the senior generals of the Monfei military and the instructors of the 5 countries said about us? They said that we did not deserve to be soldiers. They said that we did not even have the most basic discipline of a soldier. They said that we were too far behind the Chinese students. They said that you used a knife to commit murder. In order to ensure the safety of the other country's students, the arbitration committee had to isolate you alone until you boarded the plane back home. Fiona, you've made us lose our last shred of dignity. Do you still not understand?" Lu Enna really didn't understand, but now she understood. The blood drained from her face. No, I didn't want to do this. You don't want it to be like this, but it's the truth. Get in the car. You can't sit in the same car as us. After Li Shanli finished speaking, he got into the car with the help of the male student who had already gotten in. Lu Enna, who was given special treatment, left the competition venue alone in a car and returned to the camp. In the end, even her luggage was packed by Li Shanli. She was carried to the minibus to the airport by 2 Monfei soldiers, one on the left and one on the right. She waited patiently for the Korean students to arrive. She paid a heavy price for her actions and implicated all the students. When the upper echelons of Korea's military found out about this, Lu Enna's father was scolded badly by their president and was almost fired on the spot. In other words, not only had she caused trouble for the students, but she had also caused trouble for her own father. She had even been disqualified from the competition. Even if her father was a commander, he would not be able to protect her. Chapter 3691. When the Japanese students found out about this, the Korean students had already left the camp. The Japanese students, who were usually serious, became even more serious. It was as if someone owed them a lot of money and refused to pay them back. The Korean students were disqualified because of the Chinese students. So, you all need to be very careful. Don't let the Chinese students find out that you have violated the rules. I don't want our students to be disqualified like the Korean students. They didn't get any glory and returned to China with shame. If a Chinese student violates the rules of the competition, you can use the same method to get the Chinese student disqualified. But the Chinese students are very smart. Be careful not to fall into their trap. The Japanese instructors warned their students that night. They had already regarded the Chinese students as their #1 competitor. After the incident with the Korean students, they were even more wary of the Chinese students. They were afraid that the Chinese students would secretly plot against them. In this regard, the Chinese students expressed their innocence. The next day, Seeing the tense faces of the Japanese students, Li Jinyin said to them, "You'd better not go over and talk to them now. It will make them feel like they're facing a great enemy. Don't go and look for trouble." The male students didn't know what to do. They were very curious and asked, "Why? You sent the Korean students directly back to China. They are worried that your next target will be the Japanese." Facing the students' curiosity, Li Jinyin explained. The Chinese students remained silent in the face of the Japanese students' caution. In the next few days, as long as the Japanese students met the Chinese students, they would feel like they were facing a great enemy, just like Li Jinyin said. On the morning of the 6th day, after seeing Yi Qian's shooting skills, they were worried that they would be shot in the head by her. Was he suffering from delusional victimization? On the afternoon of the 6th day, during the indoor pistol shooting competition, the Japanese students drew lots to compete at the same time as the Chinese students. The Chinese students could clearly see that their backs were straightened instantly, and they checked their bulletproof vests over and over again. Tianqin wanted to go over and tell them not to be so suspicious. She didn't want to affect their performance during the competition. Yi Qian thought it was funny, but it was better to be on guard than to be looked down upon. Seeing Tianqin trying to restrain herself, Yi Qian smiled and said, "Check your equipment properly. I won't have time to check your equipment once we're inside." On the 6th day, the whole day was a shooting competition. In the morning, it was outdoor shooting, and in the afternoon, it was indoor shooting. Darkroom shooting, as the name implied, referred to shooting in a dark room. This was a very difficult shooting competition. Because there was no light, they relied on a strong flashlight. There was also a time limit to shoot all the targets. The difficulty was not ordinary. When the instructors from the other countries received the rules of the competition, their brows furrowed. Even the usually calm Chinese instructor, Li Jinyin, clenched his fists slightly. In his memory, he had never seen Yi Qian undergo indoor shooting training like this before. The trainees and instructors were still separated. When Yi Qian received the rules of the competition, he smiled at the trainees and said, "First, you will be divided into groups of 2. Then you will be divided into groups of 6. I will be the shooting team." Zhang Minghong looked up. "Are you very confident?" Yi Qian, who was standing under the blazing sun, nodded. "Yes, I am confident." When she said that, all the trainees relaxed. The originally tense atmosphere immediately dissipated. As long as Yi Qian was confident, it was fine. Chapter 3692. Yi Qian smiled and said, "Don't be nervous. Look at the students from Japan. It's obvious that they haven't undergone similar training. This kind of darkroom shooting training is very rare. The students from other countries are probably in the same situation as us. Relax a little. The more relaxed your shooting brain is, the higher your accuracy will be. Let's split into groups first, then arrange them in detail." The indoor pistol shooting was done in a darkroom. There were a total of 22 targets. The shortest distance was 20 meters, and the furthest distance was 50 meters. There were also civilian targets that couldn't be shot. The rules required 2 people to be in a group and 3 groups to shoot at the same time. Each group had a squad leader. The squad leader was in charge of the shooting and couldn't participate in the shooting. Yi Qian's group had Zhang Minghong as the squad leader. The 3 groups were divided into 3 groups. One group was in charge of guarding, one group was in charge of shooting, and one group was in charge of clearing. The squad leader was in the clearing group, so there was only one person in the clearing group. However, the students didn't want the shooting group to have any remaining targets to clear after they finished shooting, because that would lower their score. The shooting group would only get the highest score if they could clear all the targets at once. After the groups were divided, Yi Qian whispered a few words to Jiang Yang. Jiang Yang nodded lightly and made an okay sign to show that he understood. He would definitely cooperate with Yi Qian and complete the indoor shooting. The one who would actually complete the shooting was actually Yi Qian. Because Jiang Yang needed to use a strong flashlight to illuminate the area, Yi Qian had to complete all the shooting under the strong light for 3 minutes. Yi Qian wasn't trying to comfort them when she said that she was confident. She never exaggerated when it came to such things. If she was confident, then she was confident. She wouldn't pretend to be confident just to save face. 4 years of hellish training with Principal Chun included darkroom shooting. Otherwise, why would those 4 years be called hellish training? The 3 Chinese groups were quickly arranged. Outside, the instructors from each country were already standing in front of the large electronic monitoring screen. They could see their own students shooting, but their eyes were intentionally or unintentionally looking towards the Chinese side. Yi Qian once again crushed the competition and took first place in the outdoor shooting competition. She had left an indelible impression on the students and instructors from all over the world, so she became the center of attention in the afternoon. Therefore, the instructors all wanted to take this opportunity to observe how she would complete her shooting. During the team competition, Yi Qian did not stand out. Everyone cooperated with him, but when it came to the individual competition, there was nothing he could do. With all the instructors watching him, he could not keep a low profile even if he wanted to. Yi Qian knew that her shooting was different from others. In a shooting competition like this, where people could see her, she deliberately hid her differences. That was why she found Jiang Yang, who was in the same shooting group as her, and asked him to remember not to shine a strong light on her body after they entered the room to avoid being seen clearly. The competition only focused on the results. There were no requirements for the students to complete their shooting, so they did not pay special attention to the students' shooting movements. They only focused on the target area. The instructors who wanted to see how Yi Qian shot were destined to miss. The Japanese students were ready and had completed all the pre-winter preparations. The Chinese students were ready and had completed all the pre-winter preparations. Following the command, a total of 36 students rushed into the room. "It's starting," one of the instructors said in a low voice. His hands were clenched tightly in front of his abdomen. More than 10 instructors were staring at the screen, looking forward to the wonderful performance of their own students. Chapter 3693. In the dimly lit room, they had to shoot 22 targets within 3 minutes. At the same time, they had to avoid civilian targets that were not allowed to be shot. Not only did this test test the students' eyesight and dexterity, but also tested the students' quick reactions and adaptability. After the shooters entered the room, they entered a state of mental tension. As soon as they entered, they realized that even the bright windows were covered with a sunscreen coating. There was also a lot of debris scattered around the room. If they were not careful, they could trip over the debris. The indoor shooting range was a 2-story shooting range. Yi Qian and the others were on the 2nd floor. As they ran up the stairs before they even entered the room, the thermal infrared sensor was already detecting the body temperature of the student walking in front. The timer installed above the door of the shooting range instantly changed to that of the last student in charge of clearing the ground. When he heard the beeping sound, he immediately looked up and saw the timer changing. He immediately said in a low voice, "The countdown has started. Yi Qian, hurry up." In order to create a tense atmosphere, there were a total of 2 timers. One was installed at the door of the shooting range, and there was another one in the room. The timer would beep every 10 seconds so that the students who were in the competition would know how fast time was passing. It would unknowingly increase the psychological pressure on them. Therefore, the instructors of the various countries could not predict how this round of competition would end. They were all as tense as the students. Yi Qian, who was running at the front, heard the beeping sound above her head and realized that the countdown had started. She did not raise her head. Instead, she gave the students behind her an OK hand signal and entered the room first. Jiang Yang followed closely behind her. The flashlight shone brightly into the dimly lit room. Before the last student in charge of clearing the ground could enter the room, Yi Qian's gunshots could already be heard. "Alert! Shoot!" One by one, the orders came out of the mouth of the class monitor, Zhang Minghong. The students in charge of alert immediately looked for the best position to be on alert. The students in charge of shooting quickly started shooting. The students in charge of clearing the ground followed closely behind the shooting team and completed their shots at the targets that the shooting team missed. Shooting 22 targets within 3 minutes was the shooting concept that Principal Chun had taught Yi Qian, apart from sniping. Sniping had to be absolutely fast and absolutely accurate. In normal battles, especially when the targets were in a mess, it was very difficult to be 100% accurate. Therefore, one had to be absolutely fast and accurate. Yi Qian really wanted to hit the target with a 100% accuracy, but time was too tight. The targets were all over the place, and she still needed to search and eliminate them. If there were 22 targets in the same direction within 3 minutes, she would only need to move in a straight line to ensure a 100% accuracy. But now, she could only try her best to hit the target with a 90% accuracy. On the screen, Jiang Yang quickly used the light source to find the target. 2 civilian targets that couldn't be shot suddenly appeared, and behind the civilian targets, 4 targets appeared one after another. Li Jinyan's cold eyes narrowed slightly. It was time to put Yi Qian to the test. The first batch of foreign instructors who had finished shooting had already walked over to the Chinese side. The Chinese students had finished the shooting competition, so they could watch the Chinese students shooting very carefully. Chapter 3694. The male student from the Chinese shooting team, who was holding the flashlight, said something in Chinese in a low voice. The student in charge of shooting had already finished shooting 2 targets in an instant. By the time the male student finished his sentence in Chinese, the student in charge of shooting had also finished shooting 4 targets. The 2 civilian targets in front of the target were safe and sound. They had successfully avoided the shooting. After observing for a while, the expressions of several instructors changed. With such a high level of difficulty, if they were not careful, they would hit the civilian targets in front of them. Usually, when several targets appeared consecutively behind the civilian targets, the students' reactions were almost the same. They would first judge how to avoid them and then finish shooting. However, the hit rate was very low, and some even directly missed their bullets. However, the Chinese students' judgment, speed, and shooting were almost completed at the same time. This surprised the instructors. They were not at the level of the military school students. They were no different from the special forces. It's very difficult to shoot at the target. The Chinese students can do it. Very impressive. Our hit rate here is 0. We hit 1 target, and the Chinese students hit all 4 targets. For the Chinese students to be able to do this, I already have a hunch that the Chinese team will win this indoor shooting competition. Also, don't you think that the Chinese team looks very relaxed? Their shooting accuracy is shocking. The shooter's reaction is beyond my imagination. I can't imagine that there is such a fast reaction. Yi Qian in the indoor shooting competition was not easy. There were too many civilian targets mixed in. 1 more minute. Zhang Minghong, who was commanding, reminded in a low voice. He could only watch and talk, but he could not raise his gun and shoot. He was very confident in Yi Qian and calmly commanded Jiang Yang to bring Yi Qian to a certain position. While keeping a close eye on the time, he did not dare to relax at all. His command also played a key role. He had to direct and arrange where the security team should be. If he arranged it well, it would also give the Chinese team bonus points. In a team competition, it was not only about the individual, but also about the cooperation between the team. This also accounted for a certain percentage of points. Jiang Yang was also nervous. Yi Qian's shooting speed was very fast. He had to cooperate with him throughout the whole process. He did not want to see Yi Qian finish shooting and wait for him before the light from his side shone on him. At this time, even a second's delay would cause a big difference. The 3-minute match was very short. After a series of bang, bang, bang gunshots, time was up and the match was over. In front of the big screen, the instructors watching the Chinese team's competition stared at the numbers of the Chinese team's targets, their pupils constricting. 22 targets were completed, 21. The error rate was 0. In other words, the Chinese team didn't shoot a single civilian target by mistake. The only target they didn't hit wasn't because they didn't shoot, but because they didn't have enough time to finish shooting. The results of the other 2 groups were slightly worse. One group had 15 targets hit, and 1 civilian target was hit by mistake. The other group had 16 targets hit, and 1 civilian target was hit by mistake. This result was above average and could not be considered bad. Li Jinyan was quite satisfied with the results. The onlooking instructors only dispersed after expressing their amazement. In the past few days of competition, the Chinese side's strength had always been at the top. Although they already knew that the Chinese side was very strong, after every competition, they were still surprised by the Chinese side's results. Chapter 3695. The figure of the Japanese instructor also flashed among the spectating instructors. It seemed that he didn't want Li Jinyan to see him. After learning of the Chinese team's result, he only stayed for a short while and then left quickly. When he left, his jawline was so tight that the muscles on his face were as hard as stone. His eyes were grim. This round was over. Japan had not overtaken China. After finishing the indoor shooting, the students did not meet their instructors and quickly entered another round of pistol and rifle shooting. In accordance with the rule that no communication was allowed between the students and the instructors during the competition, it was really a competition between students. This shooting competition was different. Pistols and rifles were each equipped with 5 magazines, but there were only 3 bullets in each magazine. After the 3 bullets were fired, the students had to change the magazine immediately to complete the shooting. The pistols and rifles were equipped with a total of 30 bullets. For rifle shooting, there were 15 flashing targets, while for pistol shooting, there were 30 fixed flashing targets. The main point of the competition was that when the referee shouted, "Change magazine," the students of the country who finished shooting the fastest and had the highest hit rate would win. The last rule was that for every bullet left in the students' magazines, 1 point would be deducted. This is a test of the speed of changing magazines and shooting. Let's not talk about the number of hits. First of all, we must make sure that all the bullets in the magazines are used up. It's too difficult to get 1 point. It's too easy to get 1 bullet. Yi Qian said softly as she carefully checked the pistols, rifles, magazines, and the number of bullets in the magazines. Her eyes were fixed on the weapons in her hand, and she did not stop to communicate with her comrades who were fighting side by side. They had to hurry, and there was no extra time to discuss. On the battlefield, rifle combat is about suppressing fire. The more enemies you kill, the safer it is for your own people. If you can't keep up with the speed of changing clips, the enemy's bullet volume will increase by a few seconds, and the chances of you getting shot will increase by a few seconds. Therefore, you must be able to change clips quickly to ensure the safety of yourself and your comrades. Not to mention pistol fighting. Pistols are a melee weapon. When you use pistols, you're often very close to the enemy. Changing magazines is a race of life and death. If you are slow for 1 second, the enemy's bullet is likely to hit you in that second. The focus of this competition is on reaction speed, and the hit rate is actually low. You have to shoot quickly and change the magazine as soon as you hear the command. Remember, don't show that you still have bullets left. If it really did happen, then there was nothing they could do. After a few days of competition, Yi Qian had a certain understanding of the strength of the 17 players. There was a possibility that they would not run out of bullets. The targets for rifles and pistols flashed. Just like in the room earlier, there were also civilian targets. The contestants had to accurately determine the target and at the same time, quickly change the magazine. They had to complete their battle positions and finish all the bullets in the magazine in a short period of time. Although the lighting was good, the difficulty increased. There was a high possibility that there were still bullets in the magazine. It was possible for China, and it was also possible for other countries. While Yi Qian was interacting with his comrades, the students from other countries were also interacting with each other to ensure that they could achieve the best results. At this time, they didn't know what the results of the indoor shooting were like. Their psychological pressure had lessened a lot. They whispered to each other and waited carefully. Chapter 3696. Every match was carried out in a tense atmosphere. After a series of clicks to check the performance of the guns, the Chinese students completed all the equipment checks. At the same time, they kept Yi Qian's words in mind. The matches on the 6th day were all related to shooting, and they happened to be Yi Qian's strong suit. No matter what she said, the students believed her without a doubt. During the exchange, the Chinese students also needed to familiarize themselves with the guns. The rifles and pistols assigned to them this time were all things that the Chinese students had never come across before. If they were unfamiliar with the subject of the competition, they had Yi Qian's help. But if they were unfamiliar with the weapons, they had to familiarize themselves with them after Yi Qian explained it to them. The German military had also taken into consideration that the students from various countries might not be familiar with the weapons assigned to them this time. Therefore, the exchange period was set at 10 minutes. 10 minutes was enough for them to familiarize themselves with the weapons before the competition. The FAMA's rifle is manufactured by the Saint Etienne Arsenal. It has a very fast firing rate and a very concentrated trajectory. The 25 bullets are all concentrated in a very small area. This means that the distance to the target later is very small. Of course, we can't rule out the possibility of a random gun. The barrel of this rifle is located at the back, so it's closer to the shooter's head. It makes a lot of noise when firing, so the shell casings and smoke will affect us. So, we have to be careful when shooting. Yi Qian picked out the key points of her understanding of the rifle to share with the students. She explained it simply, but it was very helpful to the students. They had a general understanding of the rifle in their hearts. They did not understand it, but Yi Qian knew all the guns that would appear in the competition. This made the students very puzzled. How could she be so familiar with so many guns? And where did she get her knowledge of them from? The University of Science and Technology of China? Impossible. Didn't you see that the 3 students from the University of Science and Technology of China were listening very carefully to Yi Qian? They clearly did not know either. Shi Luhui, who was standing to Yi Qian's left, looked around, then leaned over slightly to ask Yi Qian, "How do you know so much about them?" A total of 6 or 7 rifles have appeared in the competition, right? There's nothing you don't know about. It's definitely not the University of Science and Technology of China who knows about them. There must be some other special channel for you to know about them, right? Yes, that's right. Yi Qian did not hide it, but she also did not say much. She just smiled and nodded. I know about them through other channels, but it's not convenient for me to say. It's not convenient to talk about it. When the other students heard Shi Lu's question and Yi Qian's answer, although they were a little disappointed, they did not pursue the matter. Since it wasn't convenient for her to say it, even if they asked again, based on their understanding of Yi Qian over the past few days, even if they chased after her and asked, she wouldn't say anything. The topic ended there, and no other students asked again. 6 people in each group will compete at the same time. Let's not talk about whether there is a shooting target. First of all, you have to ensure that the speed at which you change magazines is the same. You have to use up all the bullets in the magazines and strive to not leave a single bullet behind. There were a total of 8 areas in this rifle shooting competition. Each area was a U-shaped shooting area. Apart from the entrance, there were bulletproof layers on all 3 sides. Students from various countries would enter the U-shaped shooting area and coordinate with each other to shoot. The Japanese students seemed to have finished their exchange. From time to time, they would look at the Chinese team. The Chinese team had dropped from the top 3 to the top 4, while they were still in the top 7. If they wanted to squeeze the Chinese team down, they would have to squeeze out the top 6 or top 5. However, the Japanese students did not look at the top 6 or top 5. They only looked at the Chinese team in the top 4. No one knew what they were thinking. Chapter 3697. Perhaps it was because both countries were in Asia that this was the case. Or perhaps it was because they were picking soft persimmons from hard persimmons. They felt that even if the Chinese team made it to the top 4, they would still be weaker than the top 6 or top 5. Regardless of the reason, the Chinese team calmly accepted the Japanese team's occasional glances. It was not like they would lose anything if they looked at them a few more times, so they just let them be. After 10 minutes of exchange, the students from each country were in position. Following the command, the first batch of students quickly started the competition. They started with rifle shots, followed by pistol shots. Yi Jian was not in the first batch of shooters. She was in the third batch of shooters. Following the sound of gunshots, the command to change magazines was given. Some people were still shooting, some immediately changed their magazines, and some had just started to change their magazines. The difference was obvious from the first change of magazine. The targets flashed, and non-shooting civilian targets appeared. The students had to complete their positions and shoot while avoiding civilian targets. It was difficult to balance the two. There was always a situation where they could not cover the other side if they focused on one side. Because of Yi Qian's reminder, the Chinese team focused on the speed of changing magazines. If they could not avoid multiple civilian targets in a row, they would shoot directly at a target. They had to ensure that no bullets remained in the magazine. Shoot. Change magazines. Shoot. Change magazines. Shoot. Yi Qian repeated the command to the referee. 5 commands to shoot and 4 commands to change magazines were quickly completed. The last command was rifle shots complete. Stop shooting. 30-meter pistol shots forward. A second ago, there was still the sound of gunfire. After the shooting, there was only smoke in the air. There were no more gunshots. The students quickly ran toward the 30-meter pistol shots. As they ran, they carried their rifles on their backs. At the same time, they took out their pistols from their waists. They pulled the cartridges to allow the bullets to be loaded. When the referee gave the command, they would immediately shoot. Pistol shots begin. Handgun shooting was a fixed shot. The shooting target and the non-shooting target were stacked in order. If the students' hands were too fast and did not stop, the bullet could hit the non-shooting target, and the deduction of points would be inevitable. The entire competition was in full swing. Smoke filled the air, and the smell of gunpowder was strong. After the first round of competition, there were indeed some students who had not finished shooting. When the first batch of students, including Zhang Minghong and Jiang Yang, returned, they said to Yi Qian, "The target flashed too quickly. Sometimes we didn't even have time to retract the gun and hit the civilian target directly." The shooting speed of a rifle is just as you said. It's very focused, but it's also very easy to hit civilian targets. I was warned twice and hit civilian targets twice. I didn't hit the civilian target, and I didn't leave any bullets, but the hit rate is probably very low. There are all sorts of questions. The first batch of students had their marks deducted more severely. Yi Qian smiled and said, "This is a rare experience. You all have to remember it well. Now, let's observe the foreign participants carefully. We've been observed by them for so long. When we return to China, they'll probably put us on the table for discussion. We also need to have a good discussion to see which areas we still need to improve, and then think about which areas we need to train hard. What they have practiced, we must practice. What they have not practiced, we must practice even more. Summarizing our experience and reflecting on our shortcomings is the greatest reward of the competition. As for the ranking, we will definitely strive for it." Chapter 3698. Yi Qian's words made the 6 students who had finished their shooting laugh. They had to fight for a ranking, learn from the experience, and observe the foreign students to understand the military forces behind them. In fact, the students from every country had the same idea as the Chinese. Everyone was the same. Thinking about it this way, they didn't feel too nervous. Prepare well for the next competition. Don't think about what you did just now. Prepare well for the next competition. Yi Jian's gaze fell onto the arena as she spoke indifferently. Her beautiful face contained a trace of a carefree smile, causing others to feel at ease from her face and eyes. With him around, it made people feel at ease. There were still 2 more competitions. One was shooting in a car, and the other was rescuing students through a minefield. After these 2 competitions, today's competition would be over. Tomorrow would be the last important competition, and also the day the final results and rankings would be announced. The second batch of students finished their rifle and pistol shooting competitions. Angry voices could be heard from the field, speaking in different languages. It was very lively. In comparison, the Chinese students were much more serious. This was due to the strict discipline of our military. After going abroad, they knew that they represented the image of their country, so they were even more strict with themselves. After the foreign students finished their competitions, the 6 of them went back as they pleased, while the 6 Chinese students went back in neat rows. They were particularly eye-catching among the students from other countries. As long as the students from Japan and Thailand were not in a formation, they were also very relaxed. They had seen the Chinese students form a line of 2 and 3, and they also imitated them. However, as they learned, they would forget about it the next time. Just like now, the first batch of Japanese students still remembered to go back in neat rows. But when the second batch came back, they went back to their original form and went back as they pleased. This was the meaning of the saying, draw a tiger, but end up looking like a dog. Good luck, Yi Qian. The third batch of students was about to go on stage. The students who had finished their competitions were cheering for the students who were going on stage. Yi Qian led 5 students and gave them an okay sign. He smiled calmly and confidently and walked towards the competition field. Shooting was her forte. She didn't care if her comrades did well, but for herself, her goal was to shoot 100%. At the same time, she didn't leave a single bullet behind. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to face Uncle Chin's strict training. As a soldier personally trained by the world-class Sniper King, every shot she took was a test to see if she could become a qualified sniper. With a rifle in hand, when the target appeared, Yi Qian quickly led his team members into position and fired. 5 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Fire. Continuous shooting completed. Quick. Move in a certain direction and fire. Tut, 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 tut. The rhythmic sound of bullets being fired rang out from Yi Jian's combat position. Yi Jian's reaction was rather fast, which led the students to react as well. The students only needed to follow her commands to complete the shooting. Yi Qian, whose shooting speed was faster than the Snowfield Brigade's special forces, completed his shots at the fastest speed possible. Every bullet was sure to hit a target. After 3 rounds, he didn't even give the command to reload. The rules of the competition didn't say that the students had to wait for the command to reload before they could reload. After Yi Qian finished shooting, he quickly reloaded. By the time the rifle competition ended, Yi Qian had already finished shooting ahead of time. Chapter 3699. Previously, Yi Qian had held back a little and allowed herself to shoot at a longer speed. However, at this point, she had to seize every second and shoot at the speed she usually did during training. No one would pay attention to whether or not she had changed her magazine in advance. The students around her didn't have the time to do so, and the referee who gave the command was observing the entire situation. He couldn't just focus on Yi Qian, so no one noticed that she had changed her magazine in advance. Moreover, she had been holding the gun the entire time, so she didn't attract any attention. The foreign instructors wanted to pay attention, but they could only see the backs of the students. Therefore, after this round, no instructors paid attention to Yi Qian. However, Li Jinyan's binoculars were locked onto Yi Qian the entire time. He noticed that she had changed her magazine before the command was given. His thin lips curled into a faint smile that was fainter than smoke. The Chinese students were able to enter the top 5 this time, largely because of Yi Qian. If it weren't for her, they probably would have fallen out of the top 5. The current top 5 and top 6 were Germany and France. Entering the handgun shooting competition was more difficult than shooting with a rifle. It was easier to shoot civilian targets. The students from various countries, with their backs drenched in sweat, entered the handgun shooting area as quickly as possible. The sound of bullets being fired from a handgun was lower than the sound of a rifle being fired. Previously, it had been tut-tut-tut until it hurt the ears. Now it was bang, bang, bang. It sounded a little like the sound of firecrackers in China. The students who were running and pulling out their handguns began to shoot nervously. Faced with the flash of shooting and non-shooting targets, everyone's gaze was focused on the target they were facing. They didn't even dare to look out of the corner of their eyes. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of gunshots reverberated throughout the entire arena. Dozens of students fired, and the smoke of gunpowder filled the air. It really felt like they were on a battlefield. Yi Qian, who was staring straight ahead, stretched out her hands and gripped her handgun tightly. Under her goggles, her dark eyes were as deep as water. There was a cold glint in her eyes as she fired one shot after another at the target. She definitely had to fight for a ranking, and she had to do her best to get to the top. How could they even miss the invitation? How much did they look down on the Chinese side? As a representative of the country, she had the responsibility to win glory for the country. The first magazine was finished with 3 bullets, and the second magazine had been replaced. The bullets were loaded and fired. Her speed was so fast that the bullets were almost continuous. There was no sound of a break in the bullets, nor was there any pause between the reloading of the magazine. This time, because it was a single target, the referee and the soldiers next to him noticed it. The first time they saw it, they only took an extra glance and paid attention. The second time, they noticed it. Before the command to change the magazine was given, she had already changed it. The soldier wanted to go forward and remind her, but the referee stopped him. As long as she has enough time, she can change the magazine in advance. It's not against the competition rules. In such a short period of time, she actually managed to change the magazine in advance. She was so fast that she was waiting for the target to appear. The referee did not look at anyone else but Yi Qian. This stare made his heart beat so fast that it felt like it was going to jump out his chest. If he hadn't been watching closely, he wouldn't have believed that there could be such a fast-firing speed. Too fast, too fast. She fired very quickly and changed the magazine very quickly. Oh, no, no, no. It was because she fired very quickly that she was able to change the magazine faster than the other students. Chapter 3700. The 3-minute shooting time was almost up. The referee, who was about to have a heart attack, swallowed hard. He still remembered the password. When the shooting time was up, the Chinese female student he had been staring at calmly put away her gun. She had no idea what kind of visual impact her shooting had made on others. The shooting competition was over. The referee looked at the Chinese female student who turned around and walked back to the line. She seemed to look at him, but also seemed to not look at him. She walked away with the other students with steady steps. I think I need to rest for a while and catch my breath. The referee clutched his chest and breathed heavily. He really did look like he was having a heart attack. The young soldier did not stare at Yi Qian like the referee, so he did not suffer any impact. Seeing that the referee's expression was not right, he immediately went to support him. The sun was a little hot today. It was as if summer was coming early. It was so hot that sweat kept coming out. Monfei did not say that the referee had a heat stroke. The soldier just thought that the referee had been too tired these past few days and was sick. Yi Qian returned to the line. Zhang Minghong and the other 12 students saw the gentle smile on her face. They all smiled at the same time. Yi Qian's performance in the competition just now must have been very outstanding. After the rifle and pistol shooting competition, it was time for the car shooting competition. Then it was time for the rescue through the minefield. Although each competition was short, the technical content of each competition was the same. The physical and mental exhaustion was very high. The senior generals of Monfei received the referee's report. After a short moment of surprise, they chose to shake their heads and laugh. That's impossible. I've never met someone like that. According to what you said, her shooting speed is better than a special forces soldier. She's just a military school student. There's no way she can compare to a special forces soldier. Of course, we have to admit that this Chinese female student is very good. Her comprehensive ability made Colonel Fellet from West Point exclaim. We all know that she's really good, but no matter how good she is, she can't be better than a special forces soldier. Well, how should we put it? We can only say that she's better than many military school students. Maybe she can really become a special forces soldier in the future. But who knows? Although the Monfei military was shocked by Yi Qian's performance, it was not enough to make them feel afraid. What they were really afraid of was the soldiers behind the Chinese students. To be able to nurture such a powerful cadet, there must be a very powerful army behind him. This was the focus of their attention. As for Yi Qian, that was not the main point. This was also why Yi Qian dared to show off his unique skills in front of the judges. They would not pay special attention to him because of his personal achievements. What they cared about was the country and the military he was loyal to. It was worth mentioning that the Japanese students did not want to meet the Chinese students, but they also wanted to surpass the Chinese students. In a minefield, the Japanese students became neighbors with the Chinese students. When the Japanese students saw this, their faces changed on the spot. It wasn't fear, but the solemnity of a battle with the enemy. Yi Qian, who had wanted to laugh, restrained his smile so as not to scare the other party. The rescue in a minefield referred to the rescue of the driver who drove the Hummer into a minefield and was trapped. The driver was played by a Mon-faced soldier, and the students from various countries entered the minefield to rescue the driver. The students had to be very careful when they entered the minefield, because it was a minefield. If they made a wrong judgment, they would be directly judged to be killed. Chapter 3701. The Chinese students had never trained for a competition like this before. It wasn't just the Chinese students who had not trained for it. There were also students from other countries who had not trained for it. It was the same for Yi Qian's team. After spreading out the landform map of the minefield, the 18 students sat together and began to make a detailed plan. I know how to drive, but I don't know if the Hummer in the minefield is good or bad. After we get there, we'll first rescue the wounded, check on their injuries, bandage them, and treat them. If the Hummer is good, we'll put the wounded in the car and I'll drive them out. The problem now is that we need to know where the minefield is and where the non-minefield is. Yi Qian, who was holding a pencil in his hand, slowly traced the landform map. His brows furrowed slightly, and he looked up to ask Zhang Minghong, "What's your plan?" Zhang Minghong, who had been staring at the map, frowned. When he heard this, he looked up at Yi Qian and said hesitantly, "This is my judgment. Look, this is the entrance. The trapped Hummer and the driver are in this position. Can we judge that the Hummer drove through a non-minefield? That makes sense. If the Hummer drove through a non-minefield, we can totally follow the Hummer's path. This is a route that can quickly enter the minefield, but I keep feeling that something is wrong." As the students discussed in low voices, Zhang Minghong spoke again. "Yes, I also feel that something is wrong. Since this is a minefield rescue, the inspection team would not leave such a loophole for us. Just now, I've been suspecting that the path the Hummer drove through might be a minefield. Leaving such a big loophole for us is purely to bait us. Yi Qian, do you think this is possible?" Yi Qian, who was asked, laughed. "Yes, it's very possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a minefield rescue. Looking at the landform of the entire minefield, I think this route can be." Zhang Minghong saw that Yi Qian supported his idea, and his furrowed brows relaxed. He used a pencil in his hand to draw a line on the map. "Go in from here, go around here." As Zhang Minghong's pencil slowly drew across the paper, the team members discussed it, and Yi Qian carefully deployed the plan. A clear rescue route was drawn out. During the competition, some foreign soldiers chose to follow the Hummer's driving path into the minefield. As a result, as soon as they entered the minefield, they were judged to have struck a mine and died. The Chinese students couldn't help but rub their foreheads. That was indeed the case. Even though they had made very detailed arrangements, 3 of the Chinese students still died because of a misjudgment when they entered the minefield. Facing the dead students, they still had to continue entering. This time, they were even more cautious. Even Yi Qian was on tenterhooks, just in case. Fortunately, the Chinese students did not encounter any problems in the end. They successfully rescued the driver of the Hummer, checked his injuries, bandaged his wounds, and then went to Yi Qian to restart the Hummer and drive it out of the minefield according to the track they had just entered. When they came out, everyone's backs were drenched in sweat. At this time, it was already close to dusk, and the victory flag was already planted in the competition venue. In front of them, there were already a few flags of other countries fluttering in the wind. It's still too late. We're already in 6th place. Tianqin counted the flags of other countries fluttering outside the minefield in front of them and felt a little regretful. When she saw that Japan had only just driven their Hummer out and the Chinese team was already in 1st place in Asia, she couldn't help but feel happy. At this time, the Chinese students had not realized that something big was about to happen. Chapter 3702. After Tianqin finished laughing happily, she looked up at the bright red national flag fluttering in the wind. She stared at it for a long time, her eyes full of respect. Yi Qian also looked up, her eyes filled with the same respect. She stared deeply at the national flag. She thought about how they had raised the national flag together in a foreign country so that the returning foreign soldiers could see it. Just thinking about it made her heart surge with emotion. The five-starred red flag fluttering in the wind, the victory song so loud. Yi Qian, who was singing deep in his heart, replied to Tianqin, "I've never had a training like this before. It's not easy to get sixth place. Before this, I was prepared for the worst. My ranking in this competition might fall out of the top 10. Now that I'm sixth place and first place in Asia, I'm quite happy." Tianqin's sweet voice rang out. "Yes, I'm quite happy now, too. Let's go and gather." The two girls looked at each other and smiled. They looked up together again and stared deeply at the fluttering national flag before trotting over to gather. The returning Japanese students had already seen the Chinese national flag fluttering in the wind. They clenched their hands so tightly that their nails dug into their palms. The male student driving the Hummer stared at the bright red national flag fluttering in the sunset with a cold look in his eyes. He really wanted to tear down a national flag that was so glaring to his eyes. The national flag was placed on the field, which meant that the Chinese students had already taken down the minefield. The Chinese students had once again finished the competition ahead of them, beating them again and again, making their national flag line up behind the red national flag of the Chinese side again and again. How great would it be if they didn't have this red flag? How great would that be? The Japanese student driving the military Hummer held the steering wheel tightly with both hands and maintained a uniform speed as he drove out of the minefield. Boom! Something was hit. Yi Qian, who was walking to the front of the gathering, heard the sound of something being knocked down behind him. His eyelids twitched violently, and then he saw a scene that made his expression change drastically. When the Japanese driver reversed the Hummer, he suddenly knocked down the Chinese flagpole. With a crack, the flagpole fell down, and the national flag hanging on the flagpole also fell down. Yi Qian, who had discovered this, reacted quickly. He ran back and shouted at the same time, "Stop reversing! Stop reversing!" Tianqin did not react at first. She only turned her head when Yi Qian suddenly turned around and ran back. She happened to see the Hummer driven by the student from Japan knock down the flag of their country. It was as if the Hummer did not notice and continued to reverse. Fuck! Regardless of whether it was intentional or not, Tianqin, who was a soldier, cursed in a low voice when she saw her country's flag being knocked down and crushed by the wheels. She then turned around and ran back. Tianqin had barely taken 2 steps when she felt a gust of wind blowing past her. She saw Instructor Li, who had always been cold and calm, running forward like a gust of wind. Li Jinyan was standing in front of the students who had just returned from the competition, and his eyes were fixed on the fluttering national flag. From a moment the Hummer reversed to the moment it hit the national flag, he saw it clearly. When the Hummer reversed, he noticed it. When the Hummer continued to reverse, he was already running. At the same time, he whispered to the Japanese instructor who was standing still, "You'd better pray that your students don't do anything stupid." As soon as he finished speaking, the Hummer crashed into the national flag, and then the Hummer continued to reverse. Chapter 3703. The national flag was the symbol of a country and the embodiment of a country's dignity. To the Chinese soldiers, the national flag was the life of the Chinese soldiers. As long as they were alive, the national flag would not fall. Now, seeing their country's national flag being knocked down and about to be crushed by the wheels, all of the Chinese students were enraged. Yi Qian, who was the closest and had the fastest reaction, locked her gaze on the red flag on the ground. At this moment, she only had one thought in her mind. She wanted to pick up the fallen national flag. She wanted this bright red national flag to fly high once again. Those who humiliate our country must return the humiliation. The military Hummer knocked down the flagpole, and the flag that was fluttering in the wind fell. The car was still reversing. The Manchurian soldiers had already noticed and whistled sharply, reminding the Japanese students to stop reversing. However, it was useless. It was as if the other party did not notice at all, and the car was still slowly reversing. The Japanese driver knew what he was doing and was able to keep his cool. Maki Fujino, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, said softly, "Fukumoto, we have already knocked down the flag. Maintain your current speed and reverse slowly. There's no need to rush. We cannot let the assessment team suspect us. Maintain your current speed and reverse slowly. Very good. Continue to reverse." Maki Fujino was the leader of the Japanese students. His father was a well-known right-wing figure in their country. His hatred for the Chinese was not ordinary. When he heard that Lina Fujino wanted to knock down the dazzling red flag, Maki Fujino only thought for 3 seconds before nodding his head in agreement. In those 3 seconds, he was not considering whether to do it or not. Instead, he was considering how to do it. In a short period of time, he thought of a way. He thought of a way to escape responsibility. That was to pretend that they did not notice that they had knocked down the flagpole and continue reversing at the same speed. The process of knocking down the flagpole and reversing would definitely be stopped by someone. They could continue to pretend that they did not notice and maintain the same speed. Why did they have to maintain the same speed? The reason was simple. If they had done it deliberately, then according to common sense, when they were discovered, they should have immediately accelerated to achieve their goal. It was because they did not notice and did not know that they had knocked down the Chinese national flag that they had maintained the same speed. At that time, even if the Chinese side was very angry, as long as they insisted that they didn't do it on purpose and that they really didn't find out, the Chinese side could do nothing to them. In the end, they could only swallow this anger. After he explained the plan, he said to Fukumoto Rina, "The Chinese students are very cunning. They will see through our flaws. At that time, we're likely to be like the Korean students. All our scores will be canceled to 0, and we will be disqualified from the competition. We must make it so that no matter how angry the Chinese are, they can't do anything about it. They can't do anything to us like they did to the Korean students. Later, as long as we don't admit that we did it on purpose and apologize to the Chinese students, and let the assessment team and the foreign military instructors see our apologetic attitude, then we can completely ignore the Chinese students. We have already apologized. If the Chinese students still have any objections, the public opinion will definitely be directed towards us. At that time, even if the Chinese side achieves good results, what's the use?" Chapter 3704. Fukumoto Rina, who was still thinking about how to get out of this situation, had a cold gleam in her eyes when she heard Fukumoto Maki's words. She finally understood Fukumoto Maki's real intention. She held the steering wheel tightly with both hands and said excitedly, "Previously, there were already Korean students who were disqualified because of the Chinese students. Today, we appeared again and apologized for our unintentional actions. However, the Chinese students did not accept it. When the time comes, all the participating students and instructors will think that the Chinese students do not have a tolerant heart. I think the Chinese students will feel even worse when that happens. It was obvious that we deliberately knocked down their flag, but everyone blamed them. Fukumoto Maki, don't you think this will make their country look bad again? Fukumoto-kun is indeed the most outstanding heir of the Fukumoto family. That's right, there's nothing happier than seeing their country look bad because of them." Fukumoto Maki smiled politely. This was Japan's Maki Fujino's plan. It could be said that it was many times more brilliant than Korea's plan, which was so direct that it was obvious that they were deliberately provoking China. With such a plan, Fukumoto Rina continued to reverse at the same speed, even when she heard the sharp whistles of the Monfei soldiers. Soon, the red flag on the ground was covered by the huge military Hummer. Next, they only needed to turn the steering wheel, and the front wheels would directly roll over the flag, leaving a black wheel print on the flag that the Chinese soldiers were proud of. The wheel print was not just a wheel print. It was a humiliation to the Chinese students by the Japanese students, trampling on the Chinese people's dignity. After returning to China, they could even use it as a joke, telling the Chinese students how they humiliated the Chinese people in front of the Chinese soldiers, making the Chinese soldiers unable to do anything to them, and could only endure their humiliation. If they really succeeded today, then it would show that the Chinese soldiers were very, very incompetent. If she really let them get away with their evil plan today, She wouldn't be Yi Jian anymore. Yi Qian had already raised his running speed to the limit. He was so fast that his figure became a series of afterimages. He was so fast that Li Jingyan, who was running behind him, shouted in his heart, "Qing Niao, I'm counting on you today. I'm counting on you." The lives of Chinese soldiers, the faith of Chinese soldiers, and the dignity of a nation all depend on you today. Her speed was so fast that the air and wind formed an invisible barrier that slammed into Yi Qian's face. Her cheeks were crushed and deformed. Her clear eyes, which reflected the setting sun, seemed to have a raging fire burning in them. She stared resolutely ahead until Li Jingyan, who was only 10 meters away, saw the scene in front of him. His eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He had already run to his limit, and at this moment he was so violent that the veins on his neck bulged. It seemed that if he exerted a little more force, his veins would burst. "Yi Qian!" The hoarse roars of the Chinese students came from behind, like a sudden clap of thunder in the entire arena, startling all the students who had just finished their matches. They all looked over at the Chinese students. What happened this time? Tianqin, who was running, was so shocked by the scene before her that her knees went soft. She stumbled and lost her balance, and finally fell to the ground. Li Jingyan was already behind her. Seeing this, he wanted to stop and help Tianqin up. Tianqin shouted, "Instructor Li, go and check on Yi Qian. Hurry!" Chapter 3705. She saw Yi Qian rush to the back of the military Hummer, and then grab the tailgate with both hands and dive under the wheels in a suicidal manner. Yi Qian knew that it was impossible to stop the Japanese students, so she deliberately avoided them as she ran, so that the two Japanese students wouldn't be able to see her through the rearview mirror. She was worried that once she was discovered by the two of them, they would immediately speed up in order to achieve their goal. She wouldn't even have a chance to rescue her. Therefore, she had been avoiding the two of them so that they could see her in the rearview mirror. That was why she made such a move. Yi Qian fearlessly dived under the car in a suicidal manner. Just as the front wheels were about to crush the national flag, she grabbed the bottom of the car with one hand, and the other hand grabbed the corner of the flag. She then pulled it into her arms and hugged the flag that was about to be crushed by the wheels. The chassis of the military Hummer was very tall and could fit a person under the wheels. Yi Qian's frame was slender, and she was extremely agile. Coupled with the fact that the car wasn't going too fast, all these factors combined allowed Yi Qian to successfully hold the flag in her arms. However, the 5 fingers that grabbed the flag still scratched the ground fiercely, especially her middle finger. Half of her fingernail was flipped open, and her blood stained the flag that she had sworn to protect with her life. At this moment, she had completed her mission as a soldier. She had used her life to protect the dignity of her country. Yi Qian hugged the flag tightly with one hand and the bottom of the car with the other. She gently closed her eyes and heaved a long sigh of relief. This time, she didn't disgrace her mission, and she didn't let her country down. The Monfei soldiers jogging from the front didn't realize that Yi Qian had dived under the car's chassis, but the Japanese students and their instructor, Hirano Ridge, did. Fujino-kun, Fukumoto-kun. The Japanese students who witnessed everything were furious. They could still explain that it wasn't intentional when they knocked down the Chinese flag, but if a Chinese student was killed by a military Hummer driven by their own students, then no matter how they explained it, it could be considered as murder. Just like the female student from Korea, inside the car, Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto didn't know that something big had happened. They only knew that the wheels had to run over the flag that they hated the most. They had succeeded. They trampled on the faith of the Chinese soldiers and ruthlessly humiliated the dignity of the Chinese nation. They did it. Now it's time for us to explain ourselves, Maki Fujino said with a smile. Let's see how the Chinese students will accept our apology. She sneered. They can only accept our apology. Get off the car. After the car stopped, the two of them adjusted their expressions and jumped out of the car, pretending that they didn't know what had happened. The students from Japan all ran over. Those who didn't see it now knew what had happened. They were all shocked and even panicked. The expressions of the students from their own country made the two planners' hearts skip a beat. There was something not quite right. The students from their country should not have such expressions. Although they didn't tell them the plan, everyone didn't want to see the Chinese flag rise again and again. Even if they were surprised by what the two of them did, they shouldn't have such a shocked, panicked, and scared expression. There seems to be a problem, Fukumoto, Lena softly said, but her expression was very relaxed, not showing the slightest bit of guilt. Chapter 3706. Maki Fujino could also tell that something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Why would they be afraid? He could understand shock and worry, but fear was the only thing he couldn't understand. Also, none of them looked surprised. Something was even more wrong. When the car came to a stop, Yi Qian let go of the flag and lay on the ground, panting heavily. It was her first time doing something so suicidal. It was even more thrilling than going to the battlefield. She had done it all in one go. If she had to choose again, she would still do it. Yi Qian closed her eyes and panted heavily. She hugged the flag tightly and took a deep breath. She moved her legs, and her back rubbed against the uneven ground. She wriggled her way out of the car. The flag remained in her arms and didn't touch the ground a second time. Dignity that she used her life to protect should be treated with dignity. A pair of slender hands reached over. A cold voice seemed to come from a deep abyss. "Give me your hand." Li Jinyin, who was kneeling on the ground, reached out his hand. His gaze was fixed on Yi Qian, who was crawling out from under the car. His cold eyes were sharp. "Are you hurt?" This was the second sentence. Yi Qian turned her head with some difficulty and glanced outside. The corners of her mouth were already slowly curling up into a smile. "You're not injured, hiss." Before she could finish her sentence, she sucked in a breath of cold air. She wanted to hand the flag to Li Jinyin, but unexpectedly, she touched the fingernail of her middle finger. She felt a sudden pain and couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. The 10 fingers were connected to the heart. How could not hurt? Li Jinyin's expression suddenly changed. His cold voice was tinged with hostility. "Where are you hurt?" "My finger is hurt. I didn't see it. I'll come out first." "Brother, move aside. You're blocking my way out." Yi Qian could still smile. It was a relaxed smile, but there was no smile in his eyes. Both siblings had the same hostility in their eyes. When she comes out, it's time to settle the score. Li Jinyin, who had stepped aside, did not stand up. Instead, he quietly waited for Yi Qian to climb out from under the car. Then he used one hand to support Yi Qian's shoulder, and the two of them stood up together. When a mon-faced soldier saw this, his expression changed. He stopped and immediately used his walkie-talkie to contact his superiors. How to deal with this matter was beyond his ability. In order to protect their national flag, the Chinese students hid under the moving cars, but the Japanese students didn't notice? Did they really not notice? Like pretending not to hear his warning, pretending not to notice? If that was the case, then this was another murder. He had to contact the higher-ups immediately. Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto already knew why their own country's students weren't surprised. They were only shocked and scared. When they turned their heads, they saw Yi Qian standing up from under the car. Their pupils instantly contracted. Just now, a local student had told them that the Chinese student Yi Qian had crawled under the Hummer they were driving. Was she hurt? Did the wheels run over her? Or was the Chinese national flag that they knocked over? Yi Qian, who was standing straight, also saw the two of them. Her dark eyes were filled with coldness. Her gaze was like a cold arrow, and a murderous aura came straight at them. Rina Fukumoto originally wanted to see if Yi Jian had gotten the national flag. Being shot by Yi Jian's cold gaze, her heart suddenly panicked a few times. In a panic, she hurriedly swept her gaze away, and the expression on her face almost couldn't be maintained. Maki Fujino, who had already lowered his head, furrowed his brows. His mind was spinning. The Chinese student had crawled under their car and messed up their plans. Chapter 3707. Maki Fujino already had a premonition of what would happen next. The members of the arbitration committee and the assessment team would definitely be enraged by this incident. Then the Japanese students would be in big trouble. Of all their calculations, they did not expect that the Chinese student would actually throw away her life to snatch her country's flag from under the wheels. Her fearless spirit would definitely be admired by the other country's students. No, what he wanted was for the Chinese students to be suppressed by public opinion and humiliate their own country, not for them to be admired by the other country's students. This was the situation he did not want to see the most. He had to think of a way to turn this unfavorable situation around. The Chinese students had already arrived. They glared fiercely at Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto, then surrounded Yi Qian. Tianqin was a girl. She held Yi Qian's arms tightly with both hands and asked in panic, "Are you hurt? Ah, let me see if you're hurt. Are you hurt? Are you crushed? What does it hurt? Let me see," she asked repeatedly, her hands trembling as she touched Yi Qian's body. Yi Qian, who was still holding the national flag in her arms, smiled at her comrades who were worried about her. "I'm fine. Our national flag is fine too. It's very clean. There's no stain on it." Yi Qian shook the flag lightly and handed a corner to Li Jinyan. The two of them pulled the flag flat. It was very clean. Not even a blade of grass was stained. Yi Qian, who was full of respect, stared deeply at the bright red flag that gathered countless loyal souls. The corners of his mouth curled up. When the Chinese students saw this, their eyes were filled with tears. Tianqin's hands gently caressed the flag. Then, she gently and solemnly held up the flag. She lowered her head and planted a deep kiss on the flag that they loved so much. It was really clean. It was so good, so good. Go to the front and bring the flagpole over. Li Jinyan looked up and said to the male students, "There's one in front. Bring it over. The flagpole of Japan is right in front of us." "Okay." Zhang Minghong nodded heavily and strode forward. Several male students immediately followed closely behind. When the Japanese students saw the Chinese students suddenly coming towards them, they instantly made a defensive move. Their eyes followed the movements of the Chinese students, and their bodies became more and more tense. The Chinese students were walking towards them. What did they want? Do you want to fight? Do you want to cause trouble for Fujino and Fukumoto? Fujino and Fukumoto were doing this for the sake of their students. Zhang Minghong and the other 5 boys walked past the Japanese students and picked up the flagpole that had not been put up yet. Zhang Minghong and the other 5 boys walked past the Japanese students and picked up the flagpole that had not been put up yet. "What are you trying to do? Put down our flagpole." When a flagpole was picked up, the Japanese students began to question him. Several male students rushed over and tried to snatch the flagpole back. As soon as they took a step, whistles were blown urgently. The mon-faced soldiers, who had just spoken a few words with the Chinese students, were alerted by the Chinese students. They whistled and hurried over. "You broke the flagpole of the Chinese students. Now, you should give your flagpole to the Chinese students. This is your responsibility." The mon-faced soldiers shouted as they ran. "You must be responsible for your actions." No, they couldn't. If the Chinese students took away their flagpole, then their sun flag would not be able to be raised. Chapter 3708. When the Japanese students heard that even the mon-faced soldiers were on the side of the Chinese students, they looked as if they had been treated unfairly. Maki Fujino stood up. As the leader, he had to stand up at this moment. He stood up and walked towards the Chinese students. To be precise, he was walking towards the Chinese instructor, Li Jinyan. Maki Fujino clenched his fists as he walked over. He looked as if he was angry because the Chinese students wanted to take away their flagpole. However, that was not the case at all. He was indeed very angry. He was angry because he did not manage to crush the Chinese flag. His plan had failed. At the most crucial moment, the Chinese students snatched the flag back. He had never expected that the Chinese students would risk their lives to crawl under the wheels of the moving Hummer and snatch the flag back. He had underestimated the courage of the Chinese students and caused his plan to fail. If he had a second choice, he would not have done it conservatively. Instead, he would have pretended to be shocked when the flag was knocked down. He wanted a brake, but accidentally stepped on the accelerator. If that was the case, no matter how brave the Chinese students were, they would not be able to crawl under the wheels to snatch the flag back. Also, when did the Chinese female student crawl onto the vehicle? Why did he and Fukumoto not see it? Maki Fujino, who was angry because his plan had failed, stood in front of Li Jinyan. His face was gloomy, as if he was trying to maintain his etiquette. He said in a deep voice, "Instructor, why did the Chinese students insist on taking away our flagpole? Please give us a reasonable explanation." His expression was on point, as if he did not know what had happened. Yi Qian, who was staring at him, heard this and suddenly sneered. He looked at Maki Fujino with ridicule in his eyes. He wanted to play the innocent trick of pretending not to know anything. The Korean students were arrogant and stupid. Then, the Japanese students were despicable and shameless. They were shameless to this extent. Once again, they had broken the bottom line of shamelessness. Li Jinyan, who needed an explanation, lowered his eyes slightly and glanced at the Japanese students who were about 10 centimeters shorter than him. His thin lips curled up slightly. His cold expression outlined a biting coldness. Just as he was about to speak, Yi Qian, who was standing beside him, stepped forward and spoke first. "You need an explanation from the Chinese? Are you qualified?" Yi Qian did not allow his instructor, Li Jinyan, to explain the situation to a foreign military student because the other party was not qualified to listen to an explanation from a Chinese instructor. Hearing this, Li Jinyan, who was standing behind her, smiled faintly. She had said what he wanted to say. After doing such a shameless thing, he still tried to pretend that he didn't know anything to get away with it. The leader of the Japanese students seemed to be very confident in his IQ. Maki Fujino was very confident in his intelligence. He was confident that as long as Instructor Fong spoke to him, he would be able to anger him. Even if Instructor Fong wasn't angered, he was confident that he could make Instructor Fong say something unpleasant. If an instructor was agitated by a student and even said something unpleasant, then the character of the Chinese student and instructor would definitely be questioned. At that time, it wouldn't matter if the Chinese side accepted his apology or not. After all, the dignity of the Chinese side and their country had long been lost. But now, his new plan was interrupted once again. Maki Fujino's eyes flashed with malice as he looked at Yi Jian and questioned, "I'm talking to your instructor now. Please move aside." This female student had ruined his plans time and time again. He had to get rid of her. Chapter 3709. Maki Fujino. What you should be worried about now is whether your sun flag will be destroyed. Yi Qian looked coldly at the Japanese students who made him feel disgusted. His English was filled with murderous intent. "You need to pay the price for your shameless actions." Pay the price? What kind of price would they have to pay? Did the Chinese students really think that they were as easy to bully as the Korean students? I don't understand what you're talking about. You took away our flagpole like robbers, and now you want us to pay the price. Please take a good look. This is Monfei, not China. Please go back to your own country and be arrogant. Maki Fujino said in a deep voice. He controlled his facial expressions well. He was the type of person who said, "I'm very angry, but my self-restraint reminds me not to lose my temper." If someone who did not know the situation saw this, they might really be fooled by him. You knocked down our flag and tried to run it over with your car. Now you want to pretend that you don't know what happened? Maki Fujino, do you really think that we don't know your conspiracy? Yi Qian was too lazy to talk nonsense with this person. What could talk solve? Nothing could be solved. Maki Fujino, whose conspiracy was exposed, did not panic at all. He looked at the Chinese students with an expression that said, "Impossible, there's no such thing. I don't know anything." He frowned and said hesitantly, "We did feel that we hit something just now, but we didn't see it from the rearview mirror. Could it be that we hit your flag? I'm very sorry, very sorry." He bowed and his attitude changed 180 degrees. He apologized sincerely. "I'm very sorry. We really didn't notice it just now. If we did, we would have stopped the car. Please forgive us. We're very sorry." How could he do such a shameless thing? Tianqin wanted to rush up and give him a few slaps to vent the anger in her heart. The rest of the Chinese students were shocked by the gaze of their instructor, Li Jingyan. For the time being, Yi Qian would be the one to fight a battle of wits with Maki Fujino. However, Maki Fujino's sophistry made the Chinese students angry and worried at the same time. If he refused to admit it, the whole thing would become a stalemate. No matter how angry the Chinese students were, they could not do anything about it. In front of them, the Japanese students forcibly stopped the Chinese students who took away their flagpoles. The Manfei soldiers who came to reinforce them with guns protected the Chinese students tightly to prevent the students from both sides from fighting. Fights between students from the two countries had happened before. Please put down our flagpoles. You can't do something that will damage your image. What's the difference between your behavior and that of bandits? Please put down our flagpole. Thank you. We're sorry that your flagpole was hit, but you can't take our flagpole away. Please return it immediately. We need to complete the flag raising. At this moment, the Japanese students were huddled together in a united front. At this time, even if they knew that their own students were in the wrong, they could not back down. Once they backed down, their national flag would not be able to be raised. Seeing that the Chinese students refused to return the flagpole, Fukumoto Rina rushed from the back to the front like a mad dog and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Chinese students, you have already driven away Korea with barbaric behavior. Are you going to use barbaric behavior to deal with Japan now? We will not back down. Our Japanese soldiers will never back down, even half a step." Chapter 37:10. Hirano Ridge, who finally ran over, was so angry that his cheekbones were twitching when he heard the roars of his own students. Anyone could see that they had deliberately knocked down the Chinese flag and that they were deliberately not admitting what they had done. But now, they actually jumped out to accuse the Chinese students of being barbaric. Knocking down the flag of another country was already a very stupid act. They had already been caught by the Chinese, and yet they still wanted to escape responsibility. They even jumped out to accuse the Chinese. Did they want to be like the Korean students? Hirano Ridge adjusted his breathing and walked straight to the middle of the confrontation between the students of the two countries. He first bowed slightly to the Chinese students to express his apology. Then, he turned around and looked at the Chinese students with a cold face. Since we broke the Chinese flagpole, we should be responsible and return the flagpole to the Chinese. They had already caused such a big trouble and still wanted to stop the Chinese from taking the flagpole. Did they want to make things worse? Compared to instructor Kim Jong-jae, instructor Hirano Ridge's IQ was one level higher. He needed to turn big things into small things and small things into nothing. Therefore, he needed to show weakness first. Only by showing weakness could he calm the anger of the Chinese students. But this time he was wrong. When a country's dignity was trampled on, only by ruthlessly returning the favor could they barely calm the anger in their hearts. The Chinese student Zhang Minghong walked to Hirano Ridge's side and said with a cold gaze, "We will report this matter to the arbitration committee and call your country's embassy at the same time." Deliberately knocking down our flag and now accusing our Chinese students of being barbaric. The actions of your students have far exceeded our tolerance. No country's flag is sacred and inviolable. Alerting the embassy would inevitably alert the country. At that time, it would no longer be a conflict between students, but an issue between countries. Instructor Hirano Ridge's heart sank when he thought of bringing trouble to his country before he even got a place in the competition. "I will negotiate with your instructors and bring our students to apologize to you." Hirano Ridge had already realized the seriousness of the situation. When the Japanese students behind him heard that they would directly report to the embassy, their faces changed. Obviously, they did not expect the situation to escalate to an issue between countries. Fukumoto Rina's fingers trembled as she turned to look at Fukumoto Maki, who was still standing beside Fong Shuedo. At this time, Maki Fukumoto's hands and feet were trembling as he stared at the Manfei soldier who was speaking. His chest was heaving up and down. All military Hummers used for the competition have surveillance cameras. whether or not the Japanese students deliberately knocked down the Chinese flag. We might be able to find clues through the surveillance cameras. Now, please wait patiently. The officers of the arbitration committee will arrive very soon. Fearing that the Chinese students, in fact, the Chinese students from the Chinese students arrived at the same time. On one hand, they were providing emergency support. The Chinese students were actually very restrained. Although they all wanted to rush up and beat up the Japanese scholar, they all held themselves back. If they really beat him up, even if they were reasonable, it would be unreasonable. They might even be bitten back by Japan. Maki Fujino glanced at the Hummer parked at the side, and a dark glint flashed across his eyes. There's actually surveillance. At that time, Maki Fujino pursed his lips tightly. Chapter 37:11. As long as he could not see the surveillance camera, then his conversation with Fukumoto Rina would not be known. Therefore, there was only one thing he needed to do next: destroy the surveillance camera. Just as Maki Fujino was thinking of ways to destroy the surveillance camera, he suddenly heard the Chinese instructor say to referee Mon Fei, "Before the surveillance camera is retrieved, our students need to be present. The Japanese students are not allowed to come close. After the surveillance camera is retrieved, our students will escort them. The Japanese students are not allowed to come close." Yi Qian, who noticed his trembling hands, coldly smirked and said, "The two Japanese students who were driving the military Hummer just now need to be further away. We will apply to isolate them separately until the surveillance camera is retrieved." Hearing this, Maki Fujino suddenly raised his head. His gaze seemed to have been dipped in the most sinister poison. His eyes were narrow, and with such a gaze, they looked more like a pair of poisonous snake eyes. He gritted his teeth and said coldly, "You have no right to isolate us. Not us, but the arbitration committee. They have the right to execute, and you have the obligation to cooperate." Hirano Ridge led all the Japanese students towards the Chinese side. Walking in front of them were Zhang Minghong and a few other Chinese students who were holding a flagpole. Maki Fujino, who was still planning how to destroy the surveillance camera, heard footsteps behind him. He retracted his gaze and looked back at the instructor, Hirano Ridge, who was walking towards him. If he could not destroy the surveillance camera, perhaps the instructor could. The first thing Hirano Ridge did when he walked over was to give Maki Fujino a hard slap. This slap caused Maki Fujino's head to tilt to one side, and there were 5 fresh fingerprints on his face. Without giving Maki Fujino a chance to speak, Hirano Ridge, who knew the severity of the situation, loudly reprimanded him and asked him to apologize to the Chinese students. Fukumoto Rina was also with them. As Zhang Minghong said, the Chinese students did not accept their apology. Neither of them had the chance to apologize. Li Jinyan directly said to Hirano Ridge, "There is no need to apologize for things that cannot be solved with an apology. I hope that after the surveillance camera is retrieved, your students will continue to firmly believe that they did not do it on purpose." When the Japanese students who followed them heard that there were surveillance cameras in the car, they were all dumbfounded. There were surveillance cameras. Then, who was right and who was wrong could be judged through the surveillance camera. Hearing that there was a surveillance camera in the car, Lina Fukumoto's face turned pale on the spot. Was the entire conversation between her and Fujino-kun recorded? Wouldn't all of Fujino-kun's plans be exposed? 3 generals from the arbitration committee quickly arrived. One was a Russian general, one was an American general, and the last one was a Russian general. The 3 generals rushed to the scene in the same car with solemn expressions. The situation at the scene was very good. There was no chaos, but the atmosphere was very tense. It was as if an arrow had been pulled to the bowstring, and the slightest mistake would break the silence. Lina Fukumoto couldn't hold on any longer. "Calm down, Fu Bankin." Maki Fujino, who could still hold on, reminded him in a very soft and cold voice. "Destroy the surveillance cameras, and we can escape." "How do we destroy it?" Fukumoto Rina asked anxiously with sweat on her forehead. At this time, the sky had gradually darkened, turning into a misty green color. Although people's faces could still be seen clearly, it was as if they were covered with a thin layer of gauze. It was impossible to see everyone's expression at first glance. Using the faint darkness of the night as a cover, Maki Fujino's face was gloomy as he spoke of his latest plan. After the surveillance cameras are retrieved, we will use the rifles in our hands to create chaos. You will cover for us, and I will destroy the equipment in their hands. In a short period of time, the ruthless Maki Fujino had a new plan. Chapter 37:12. The rifles loaded with blanks were still in their hands, becoming Fujino Masahiro's personal weapon. When Fukumoto Rina heard that he would destroy the equipment, she couldn't help but worry. Taking advantage of the fact that the general of the arbitration committee was still asking the referee and the Monfei soldiers about the situation, she lowered her voice and asked, "Fujino-kun, please tell me your detailed plan. I will definitely cooperate with you." Since he and Fujino-kun cooperated to knock down the Chinese flag, then he also had the responsibility to deal with the aftermath. He couldn't let Fujino-kun bear the responsibility alone. Only by bravely shouldering his own responsibility would he not lose the spirit of the samurai. Fukumoto Rina came from a samurai family, which was also very famous in the local area. Her ancestors had once come to the Chinese territory and committed countless crimes. To this day, not only did their family not feel ashamed, but they also felt proud of it. After the defeat, her ancestors returned to China. After they passed away, there was a diary among their belongings. It clearly recorded everything that their ancestors did in the Chinese territory. The words were full of a sense of superiority, and the word Shina was used again and again in the diary. At the same time, it constantly emphasized how noble the Japanese were and how they were above the Chinese at that time. This diary was kept as the glory of the Fukumoto family until today. When Fukumoto Rina came of age, her father solemnly handed this diary to her. Fukumoto Rina, who spent almost a week reading it, felt deeply proud of her ancestors and was proud of it. As time passed in the diary, Fukumoto Rina's ancestor left more and more bad news in the diary. Until the day of the surrender, Fukumoto Rina's ancestor's diary stopped. He said that this was the biggest regret in his life, and this regret was given to him by the Chinese people. It made him disappointed in his life, and it also made him regret for the rest of his life after returning to China. Fukumoto Rina was originally from the right wing. After reading her ancestor's diary, her hostility towards the Chinese deepened. This was also the main reason why she dared to do such a bold thing. The Fukumoto family and the Fukumoto family were no different. The difference was that Fukumoto's grandfather was still a high-ranking official at that time. After the defeat, he was able to return to Japan. Similarly, because he didn't fulfill his wish, he also died of depression after returning to China. Before he died, he lamented that he didn't complete the great feat of the past. The two students from right-wing families shared the same hostility towards the Chinese side. Now that the matter was about to be exposed, they hated the Chinese side and its students even more. Hearing this, Maki Fujino said gloomily, "Now, it's time to see who is more ruthless. Later, I will shout that I have been insulted by the Chinese students. Then, I will use this." He gently moved the rifle that was still on his body. "I will use this to point it at my abdomen. I will use death to prove that we are innocent. As for you..." Before he could finish his plan, Fukumoto Rina instantly understood. "I got it. When the time comes, I'll also raise the rifle and aim it at my abdomen. My movement will be bigger than yours, attracting everyone's attention, and you'll take the opportunity to destroy the surveillance camera. Am I right?" "Yes. In fact, I wanted to shoot the bullet into the fuel tank of the Hummer and cause a fire in the vehicle, but I thought that military Hummers are bulletproof, so I had to give up." Since Rina Fukumoto could instantly understand his plan, it made Maki Fujino even more confident in his plan. Chapter 37:13. When the time came, he would shout loudly that he had been misunderstood and insulted by the Chinese students. Then he would raise his rifle and point it at his abdomen, using his own death to prove his innocence. This move could be said to be ruthless. However, the two of them who were whispering to each other did not notice that there was a pair of clear eyes watching them all the time, clearly seeing their little movements in the dark. Yi Qian's gaze did not move away from the two of them. Since the two of them were so cunning, now that it was time to retrieve the surveillance footage, she did not believe that the two of them would obediently wait for the surveillance footage to be retrieved. Moreover, the sky was gradually getting dark. It would be easy for the two of them to do something when the Monfei soldiers were not paying attention. Especially, they both moved the rifles on their bodies. Since they had already used their guns, it seemed that the two of them would not be too small. Using their guns? Yi Qian could not help but move the rifle on her shoulder. The rifle was a good weapon. Now it depended on how the two Japanese students would use it. However, there was still one more thing to do later. They had the flagpole in their hands. They had to raise the national flag again. The three senior generals of the arbitration committee had already understood the ins and outs of the whole matter. They were all soldiers who had been through a lot. They immediately saw through the two Japanese students' little tricks. Since they refused to admit it, they could only retrieve the surveillance footage. Li Jinyan maintained his usual indifference throughout the whole process. When it was time to speak, he was concise and to the point. When it was not time to speak, he was indifferent. He became more and more imposing and was not easy to fool. If it was just a small conflict between students, it would be fine. However, this was a major matter that concerned the dignity of the country. It had to be resolved so that people would know that the country's dignity was inviolable. The arbitration committee had initially discussed making peace if they could. However, when they saw the strong tone in the instructor's words, they knew that there was no way to make peace. They could understand the feelings of the Chinese instructors and students. If it were their own national flag that was intentionally knocked down, as soldiers, they probably wouldn't be as calm as the Chinese instructors. Thinking of this, the senior general of Monfei, who had just dealt with the Korean students a few days ago, could not help but stare at the Japanese instructor, Hirano Ryu. He did not give him any face. I think there is no need to retrieve the surveillance footage. Just cancel all the results and disqualify them from the competition. Leave the competition venue immediately and return to your country. This was the result that the instructor, Hirano Ryu, did not want to hear. When he heard this, he could not help but become anxious. The Japanese students were also anxious. Tomorrow was the last day of the competition. If they were disqualified the day before, they would become an international joke, just like Korea. No, it was worse than Korea. At that time, the international community will shift all the recent public opinion against South Korea to Japan, and it will even embarrass Japan even more. No, they did not want to be an international joke. We have already apologized to the Chinese students for our mistakes. Why can't they forgive us just this once? China is a big country. Shouldn't they have a tolerant heart and forgive us for our mistakes? Matsuyama Michiko, Japanese female student from the General Staff College, spoke. She was very calm. Even her eyes were very calm. She did not panic, even though the current situation was unfavorable to the Japanese students. We were wrong. We are not like the Korean students who refuse to admit their mistakes. Why are you questioning our sincerity? Chapter 37:14. Matsuyama Michiko first looked at the three senior generals of the arbitration committee, then at the referee of the assessment team, and finally at the instructor Li Jinyan. He was a young lieutenant colonel who fit the image of a perfect Prince Charming in the hearts of the Japanese girls. If it weren't for the fact that they were on opposite sides, Matsuyama Michiko would have run over to him in casual clothes and asked for his contact information. Unfortunately, the two of them were destined to be on opposite sides. No matter how perfect they were, they could only regret it. Excuse me, why don't you accept our apology? Do you think we're not sincere enough? Then now, as she spoke, she suddenly crossed her hands in front of her lower abdomen and bowed deeply to Li Jinyan. I'm very, very sorry. I'm very sorry about our mistake to you and the Chinese students. Please forgive us this time, okay? Immediately after, another female student from the staff college, Yoshida, also bowed deeply to express her apology. When the two female students did this, the rest of the students lowered their heads and apologized to the Chinese students once again. Even Fujino Maki and Fukuda Rina bowed their heads very sincerely. If lowering their heads could save them from being disqualified, then lowering their heads was fine. They could still tell which was more important and which was more important. This move was also played very well. In this way, if the Chinese side still didn't accept it, they would be somewhat narrow-minded. Matsuyama Michiko from the staff college did indeed intend to do so. She was reminded by her instructor, Hirano Ling, to stand up and use this move. At this moment, it seemed that this move was indeed useful. At least the three senior generals of the arbitration committee, who had been a little gloomy and cold just now, instantly eased up a lot. Compared to the Korean students who had been disqualified, the attitude of the Japanese students was much better. They were so good that they could at least see their sincerity. The Chinese students only had a cold expression on their faces. More than a dozen people exchanged glances and gestures secretly. Yi Qian nodded lightly, indicating that she could stand up directly, but she was pulled back by Zhang Minghong, who sighed softly. "We can't let you always come out and make them hate you. When it comes to the dignity of our country, as soldiers, we must stand up bravely. Now that the three of you have made your stand, it's time for the students of our Shi Luji to speak." A male student from Shi Lu's group stepped forward. "Let me say it. We'll let them know what our stance is." Hearing this, Yi Qian took half a step back and said solemnly to the student, "All right, I'll leave it to you. Don't worry." Shi Lu, who had nodded at the students from his country, pointed at the student from his country and walked up to instructor Li Jinyan. Then, he said loudly, "We can accept your apology, but you've misunderstood something. The flag that was knocked down is our national flag. So please bow down and apologize to our country's national flag." Then, he turned to Li Jinyan and said, "Instructor, let's raise the fallen national flag first. After the national flag is raised, the Japanese students can bow their heads and apologize to our country's national flag." Bowing to the flag of another country and apologizing, the Japanese students and their instructor, Hirano Ridge, looked as if they had heard something unbelievable. They stared at the Chinese participant in shock. They could apologize to the Chinese students for their actions, but they absolutely could not lower their heads to the Chinese flag. This was not an ordinary apology, but an act of humiliation and loss of the country. They could not accept such an apology. Chapter 37:15. Hearing this, Fukumoto Rina, who was still bending her waist, suddenly raised her head and puffed out her chest. If this person was a tame dog just now, then now he was a ferocious wolf. His eyes emitted a gloomy cold light. "We can't accept your request." "Then I'm sorry. We can't accept your apology either," Shi Lu said coldly, nodded slightly at Li Jinyan, and returned to the line. Li Jinyan looked at Hirano Ridge. "If your country's students accept, then please bow down and apologize to our country's flag. If not, the arbitration committee will handle it, and the embassy will negotiate as normal. Also, our country will hold a press conference on this matter. At that time, we hope to see your country's leaders apologize to our country on TV to the whole world." The Chinese students were only expressing their intentions. In that case, the Chinese instructors were expressing their ability to take action. Let the country's leaders apologize to China on TV, then. Matsuyama Michiko had cold sweat on her forehead. They had deliberately lowered their posture to express their apology, but they had never thought that the Chinese side would refuse on the grounds that it was their country's flag that had crashed into their country's flag. The cunning Chinese students had once again turned the situation in their favor. However, the three high-ranking generals of the arbitration committee felt that the Chinese student was right. If a soldier couldn't even protect the dignity of his country, how could he be qualified to be a soldier? If a soldier couldn't even do this, he wouldn't be respected by other countries. In the face of the Chinese side's toughness, the three senior generals were not disgusted. Instead, they respected the Chinese side even more. The general from the fighting nation stood up. His attitude was just like their president's. Besides being elegant, his methods and attitude were extremely domineering. What? You don't think it's good? Don't you like to bow down to others when you talk? Just now, I saw you leading your students to bow down and apologize to the Chinese students in the car. Why can't you bow down and apologize to the Chinese flag now? Now you've knocked down the Chinese flag, not the Chinese students. The Chinese students want you to apologize to their flag. I don't think there's any problem. You're willing to apologize to the Chinese students, but you're not willing to apologize to the Chinese flag that you've knocked down. In front of everyone, you're showing your sincerity in apologizing. The general of the fighting race sneered. He didn't say anything else. In any case, everyone knew what he was talking about. Instructor Pinji Ling clenched his fists, but he did not want to bow to the Chinese flag. He also needed to understand the situation. He let out a heavy sigh. When he spoke, his entire spirit seemed to have withered. Please allow us some time. Thank you. The Chinese side needs to raise the flag again. I can give you time to think about it. After the Chinese side finishes raising the flag, you must give us a reply. If not, we will not stop the Chinese side from doing anything. Moreover, we will hand over the surveillance footage to the Chinese side. When the time comes, will the Chinese side post the surveillance footage directly at the press conference? Think about it yourself. Monfei's general spoke up. He was fed up with these students causing trouble for no reason. A small country was indeed a small country. They did not have the demeanor of a big country at all. Chapter 37:16. It was not easy to organize a large-scale international competition. If it was successful, it would add credit to his military career. However, if trouble kept appearing, his ability would be questioned and it would affect his future development. It might even be used by his political opponents as evidence to pull him down. The more he thought about it, the angrier General Monfei became. His face became gloomier and gloomier. He looked at the Japanese students with particularly cold eyes. You knocked down the Chinese flag because the Chinese students are stronger than you. Jealousy like the devil made you make a mistake. If you knock down the flag that the soldiers of any country have sworn to protect, I will understand whatever the Chinese side will do next. And you Japanese soldiers have shown me your despicable and shameless side. The two generals of the arbitration committee had spoken. Only the American general did not say anything. However, he stood up and said with a serious expression, "Give them some time to consider. I think they will give us an answer." The relationship between Japan and the United States was pretty good. At this time, the United States general stood up to help Japan as much as he could. There was nothing else he could do. He could only let the Japanese instructors and students hear less bad words. Hirano Ridge looked at the American general gratefully. Then he bowed slightly to the generals of the three countries and the Chinese instructors. He turned around and asked Fukumoto Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto, who had caused so much trouble for his country. "I will ask again. Did you say anything you shouldn't have in the car?" He had to confirm. If they did not say anything, he would not be worried even if the surveillance footage was handed over to the Chinese side. At the same time, he would never lead his students to bow down to the Chinese flag and apologize. As a soldier, he would never do something like losing or humiliating his country. Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto lowered their heads and answered their instructors with silence. They did not say anything. Hirano Ridge knew that they had said something they should not have. Just as he was about to reprimand them, Maki Fujino said, "Destroy the surveillance footage and this matter will be solved." "Instructor, we need your cooperation." "Idiot, will the Chinese side give you a chance?" Hirano Ridge asked. "They will not give us any chance to touch the surveillance footage. Also, do you think we don't have to bow down to the Chinese flag and apologize?" Matsuyama Michiko stood up. "Instructor, the Chinese side has already raised their flag. We will also raise our flag first. When the flags of both countries are raised, we will discuss how to solve this problem." Matsuyama Michiko was buying time for her country. This was the best idea she could come up with. Yes, now was the time to think of a solution. As soon as Wild Ridge said that, The American general saw through his plan and secretly reminded him, "China will not give you too much time to delay, nor will they give you time to delay. Bow down to their country's flag and apologize. I think this is the best solution." Regardless of whether the Chinese side would give them a chance to stall for time, they would stall for time. Pinji-Ling nodded and said solemnly, "We will have the best solution. Now, there's one more thing. Our country's flag can't be raised without a flagpole." When Japan wanted to raise their national flag, the Chinese side didn't stop them. In the night, when the Chinese flag was slowly raised again, Li Jinyan said, "Salute." The Chinese students lined up and saluted the raised flag. Chapter 37:17. It was late at night. The figures of the Chinese students were as straight as the rifles they had placed beside their left thighs. They were solemn and awe-inspiring. They were like pine trees standing on a cliff. Although they were facing the abyss, they were fearless. No matter how strong the wind or how cold the snow was, it could not suppress their straight backs. These were the soldiers of the Chinese side. They stood between heaven and earth, tempered by fine steel, unyielding and unyielding. At that moment, the whole place was silent. Even the three generals of the arbitration committee were shocked by the imposing manner of the Chinese students. They stared at the Chinese flag. The Japanese soldiers also stood upright and stared at the Chinese flag as if they were staring at their own flag. This scene was captured by the accompanying war correspondent. He took the picture from behind the Chinese students. The back view of all the Chinese students was captured in the camera. In front of the camera, the blood-red and solemn national flag was also captured. Later on, this photo became the most representative photo of the battlefield. Even though there were only a dozen soldiers, they had the majestic aura of a magnificent army. From the photo, one could see the iron bones of the Chinese soldiers, as well as the majesty of a rising country. Japan then completed the flag-raising ceremony. Perhaps due to the comparison of the Chinese students and the fact that the Japanese students were preoccupied, the entire flag-raising ceremony was not as solemn as the Chinese. After the flag-raising ceremony of the two countries, the arbitration committee did not receive a reply from the Japanese. The Chinese students were not surprised by this result. Soon, a technical soldier jumped into the car and began to pull up the surveillance footage. Li Jinyan was in the car. Outside the car were Yi Qian, Zhang Minghong, Jiang Yang, and Li Xiang. Outside the car were the other Chinese students, Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto, who were isolated, exploded from their silence. It should be said that they exploded according to the plan. They did not directly target the Chinese students like the Korean students. Instead, they used suicide to complain about the unfair treatment. Hirano Ridge agreed to half of Maki Fujino's plan. However, he did not agree to destroy the surveillance footage. The reason he agreed to it was very simple. He wanted to buy more time to think of a solution. When Maki Fujino pointed the rifle in his hand at his abdomen and shouted that they were treated unfairly, Yi Qian smiled coldly. Previously, he and Fukumoto Rina were whispering in each other's ears to discuss how to put on such a show. Looking at the instructor Hirano Ling's secretly relieved expression, the coldness at the corner of Yi Jian's lips deepened. Rina Fukumoto did the same. She pointed the gun at her abdomen and shouted with her eyes red, "Just because we did not intend to do so, we are humiliated. I would rather kill myself than bow and apologize to the Chinese flag. Put your guns down. Do you hear me? Put your guns down." But the referee and the soldiers told them with certainty that the two Japanese students in the car must have heard the warning, but they didn't stop the car. It was obvious that they did it on purpose. The Monfei soldiers were all aiming their guns at the two Japanese students. It was as if they were ready to shoot as soon as the two students made any dangerous moves. Chapter 37:18. Fujino Maki was much calmer than Fukumoto Rina. He was just making a move and did not really want to hurt himself. It would be bad if he got too excited and accidentally hurt himself. The scene was very chaotic. Everyone was focusing on how to make the Japanese students put down their guns instead of pursuing the responsibility of the Japanese students. Facing the crazy Japanese students, the general of Monfei was so angry that his facial muscles were trembling. He turned his head and gritted his teeth at Hirano Ridge. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to use this method to stop the Chinese from retrieving the surveillance footage? Do you think that by doing this, I will believe that you are innocent? No, you are wrong. Your current actions make me believe that the Japanese students are jealous of the Chinese students. They did not have the ability to challenge the Chinese students, and in the end, they thought of hitting the Chinese flag to vent their jealousy. Your shameful actions should be condemned by the whole world. I will absolutely not allow you to continue making trouble for no reason. Immediately order your students to stop their ridiculous behavior. Otherwise, I don't mind executing your students on the charge of assault with a gun. Hirano Ridge kept wiping his forehead as if he was wiping away his sweat. Hearing this, he did not explain anything and walked towards the two students who had lost their minds. Aiming the rifle at his abdomen, Hirano Ridge seemed to have lost control of his emotions. He was very worried that they would really shoot at his abdomen. He only wanted to stall for time and did not want the students to get hurt. After getting closer, he knew that his worries were unnecessary. Fujino Maki looked into the Hummer, and Hirano Ridge's eyebrows twitched. I need your cooperation, instructor. Fujino Maki said softly. I will use a blank cartridge to hit the surveillance box. As long as the surveillance footage is destroyed, it will be beneficial to us. The ultimate goal was to destroy the surveillance footage. Currently, only the two involved and Hirano Ridge knew about the plan. The rest of the Japanese students were really frightened, so the atmosphere was very tense. Yi Chien, who had been standing guard in the Hummer, stared at the two who were still making a scene. When the two were making a scene and moving their feet, Yi Chien narrowed his eyes slightly. When Fujino Maki stood in front of him, Yi Chien instantly understood what the other party was trying to do. Suicide was fake. Using the blank cartridge in the rifle to destroy the surveillance footage was real. They want to use a blank cartridge to destroy the surveillance footage. Brother, do you want to cooperate with them? It's been so long, but it hasn't been resolved. It's time to put an end to it. Not only do we want them to bow their heads and apologize to our flag, we also want them to suffer the consequences of their actions. Li Jinyan, who had already obtained the surveillance footage but had yet to get out of the car, raised his eyebrows slightly. What do you want to do? Our flag was knocked down by them, so I'll knock down their flag directly. Fair enough. Yes, that's fair. Now there's an opportunity to make a move. You have to cooperate. We have to let them shoot first so that I can shoot. Yi Chan, whose words were laced with coldness, retracted his gaze and lowered his eyelids slightly to hide the hostility in the room. Let's settle this quickly. Go back and rest early to prepare for tomorrow. Sure, I'll cooperate. Li Jinyan lowered his head and looked at the small black box in his hand. He moved his finger and the small black box opened. He took out a small magnetic disc and put it in his pocket before pushing the door open and getting out of the car. In his eyes, the suicide threat of the two Japanese students was just child's play. There was no need to panic. Chapter 37:19. When Yi Chien saw him get out of the car, he followed closely behind. Noticing that Maki Fujino had not committed suicide after a long time, he pretended to cooperate with Hirano Ridge and turned the rifle around instead of pointing the muzzle at his abdomen. Yi Chien's lips curled into a cold, murderous smile. Finally, the biggest show was about to begin. Maki Fujino, who had been waiting for a long time, saw Li Jinyan holding a small black box in his hand. With a cold glint in his eyes, he said to Hirano Ridge, Instructor Fong has already gotten out of the car. Instructor, please cooperate with me. I'll shout 1, 2, 3. When I shout 3, immediately come over and snatch the rifle from me. If not for the fact that the Chinese side wanted their country's students to bow their heads and apologize to the Chinese flag, Hirano Ridge would not have taken such a risk. Since the chaos had already been created, it would not have been so obvious if they accidentally fired. Regardless of whether it was intentional or not, as long as they did not admit it, they only needed to apologize. Hirano Ridge finally nodded his head gently and agreed to the plan of the two students. However, he did not know that with his nod, what would happen next would make them feel humiliated and helpless. Li Jinyan, who had deliberately stood aside to let Maki Fujino shoot, said to the three generals of the arbitration committee indifferently, "There are a total of 22 countries participating in the competition. We can first invite the students and instructors of the 22 countries to watch the surveillance footage together." He waved the small black box in his hand and said, "As for." At the same time, the small black box exploded, and Maki Fujino was knocked away. A sudden gunshot was heard amidst the chaos. Bang! It hit the window of the Hummer, leaving a very small mark. Yi Qian, who had been prepared for this, immediately pointed his gun at Fukumoto Rina after knocking Li Jinyan away. 3 bullets were fired consecutively, hitting the rifle in Rina's hand that was still aimed at her abdomen. Gunshots rang out, and the scene was once again chaotic. Hirano Ridge, who had yet to snatch the rifle from Maki Fujino's hand, was shocked by the sound of another gunshot. However, he could not care less about Rina Fukumoto. He gritted his teeth and snatched the rifle from Maki Fujino. At the same time, he unloaded the magazine and shot Maki Fujino. When Maki Fujino saw that he had destroyed the surveillance camera, he was willing to be beaten up. He even said to his instructor, "You must hit me hard. It's best if you break my ribs. We must be ruthless to ourselves." Rina Fukumoto was frightened by the bullet. The nearby Monfei soldiers seized the opportunity to rush over and threw her to the ground. They twisted her hands and took the rifle from her hands. The 3 generals of the arbitration committee were already under the protection of the Monfei soldiers. When the 3 of them saw the rifles in the hands of the 2 suicidal Japanese students, the 3 of them walked out of the protective circle with dark faces. Blanks were equally lethal at a distance of 3 to 5 meters. Moreover, they were only about 4 meters away from each other. A bullet to the head would be fatal. Bastard! Bastard! Hirano Ridge was still using the rifle in his hand to viciously hit Maki Fujino. It seemed that this was the only way to quell the anger in his heart. At this moment, none of the Japanese students stepped forward to persuade him. Although they couldn't bear to see Maki Fujino get beaten up, they knew that if they didn't do this, there would only be more troublesome things happening. Fortunately, the surveillance footage had been destroyed. Now, they only needed to apologize. They no longer had to worry about the surveillance footage being released by the Chinese side. Chapter 3720. Don't worry, Instructor Hirano Ridge. What you hoped for did not happen. Li Jinyan walked up to Hirano Ridge, who was violently beating up his students. "I have already obtained the surveillance footage. Now, it's time for you to apologize." As he spoke, his slender fingers opened up, revealing a small magnetic disc in his palm. Maki Fujino, who had been beaten until his vision was black, fiercely raised his head to look over. He only saw Li Jinyan's hand, but he didn't see the magnetic disc. However, Instructor Hirano Ridge saw it. His pupils contracted fiercely, and there was a hint of viciousness in his eyes. The Chinese side must have seen through their plan. Otherwise, they would not have taken out the magnetic disc in advance. The 3 generals of the arbitration committee walked over. The general of the Monfei military was completely displeased with Japan. He shouted loudly, "Instructor Hirano Ridge, the Chinese flag is in front of you. Bring your students and apologize." He was not the only one who lost his patience. The Russian general had also lost his patience. There was even a hint of disgust in his words. "You only have one choice. Apologize to the Chinese flag." "No, they still have a second choice." Li Jinyan, who was looking down, spoke softly. Maki Fujino, whose face was distorted, stared at him intently, waiting for him to say what the second choice was. "Since our students have caused resentment in your hearts due to winning against you, our students suggest that each of you carry the signal flag. No matter how you run, If the student who is holding a gun can't shoot down the coordinate flag in the opponent's hand within 5 shots, you'll have to stand under the flag of the winning side and apologize. The flag of the losing side will be under the flag of the winning side. After this, no matter who wins or loses, I will immediately destroy the magnetic disc in my hand and will not pursue the matter of you shooting just now. Everything will end here. Accept the challenge or apologize immediately. Choose for yourself. There was still half a chance that they would not have to apologize if they accepted the challenge. If they did not accept the challenge, they would have to apologize immediately. Maki Fujino, who was very confident in his shooting skills, endured the pain in his ribs and nodded almost without hesitation. Instructor Hirano Ridge wanted to use the excuse that his students were almost shot to request for a change of target. Perhaps he would request that the Chinese side not send Yi Qian as the shooter. However, he was stopped by the American general with his eyes, taking advantage of the chaos to shoot and destroy the surveillance camera's small black box. This already represented a guilty conscience. The previous matter had not been resolved, and now there was a new problem. Japan did not have any chance to speak. They could only accept. If he accepted it, there was still some hope left. Why did China choose to use Japan's flag? It was because they wanted to use the same method to take revenge. However, whether or not China could succeed in taking revenge depended on their own ability. Since the condition was proposed by Yi Qian, it was only natural that Yi Qian would accept the challenge. The Chinese students believed in Yi Qian's shooting skills, but they looked up at the flag fluttering in the wind, which was the same size as the national flag. They were still a little worried. The area of the coordinate flag was very large, and they were worried that they would be hit. However, their worries were unnecessary. This was the maximum range of a rifle, and it was not certain if the bullet could hit the target. The Japanese students were very nervous. When they heard the Chinese student, Yi Qian, running ahead with the coordinate flag, their hearts almost jumped into their throats. Hirano Ridge, who was standing on Yi Qian's side, started to regret using too much force. He should not have used the butt of his rifle to hit Maki Fujino. In order to cooperate with this contest of national dignity, Japan's military switched on the night lights. The lights were turned on, and the scene was as bright as day. Yi Qian was already running. Within 5 minutes, Maki Fujino had fired 5 shots. Chapter 37:21. When the first gunshot rang out, everyone's breathing became tense. The Chinese students clenched their fists and lined up neatly as they stared ahead. After a pause, Maki Fujino steadily fired the second bullet. When he finished firing 5 bullets, he put away his rifle and wiped the sweat off his forehead. He then gestured to the Chinese students who were watching nervously, indicating that he was very confident. In an instant, the Japanese students' previous depression was swept away, and they all smiled. If Fujino-kun won, then they would not have to bow down to the Chinese flag and admit their mistake. Now, they only had to worry about whether the Chinese student Yi Qian would shoot at their flag. Hopefully, she would not be able to shoot. Hirano Ling was sweating profusely. He had completed the inspection of the Chinese flag. There were no bullet holes on it, not a single bullet hole. Maki Fujino did not shoot. He had lost. He had lost. The students from the 2 countries were divided into 2 groups. One group stood with the shooter, and the other group stood with the flag bearers. When the students standing with the flag bearers saw that there was not a single bullet hole on the flag, their expressions were contrasting. The Japanese students' faces were ashen, but the Chinese students' faces were filled with joy. Hirano Ling, who was holding the flag tightly, could not help but tremble. Li Jinyan, who did not touch the flag at all, saw this and walked to Hirano Ling's side. He said fiercely, "There are no bullet holes on it. You have lost. We will use our own method to make you lower your flag." His voice was so cold that it made Hirano Ling's hands tremble. He trembled as he returned the flag to the Chinese student. The Chinese. What method would they use to make them lower their flag? The other corner of the flag was held by the Russian general. After checking it, he gave the corner of the flag to the Chinese student beside him for safekeeping. A few Japanese students with ashen faces welcomed Maki Fujino. Facing Maki Fujino, who was walking briskly towards them, they could not help but lower their eyes in pain. Before he got close, Maki Fujino could feel the pain of the Chinese students. He could not help but stop in his tracks. His excited heart gradually sank. He wanted to ask, but the Russian soldier did not give him a chance. He took the other flag from the Chinese student and was urged to leave. "Please don't let the Chinese hit the flag in your hand. Thank you." As he turned around, he finally heard the reminder from the Chinese student. It was this reminder that made him realize that he had failed. However, an even greater failure was yet to come. While he was running wildly, the first gunshot rang out. Then, he heard the sound of the flagpole cracking. He raised his head to look, and his expression changed drastically. The flagpole had been hit. His mad dash was even more intense, and the flagpole was broken. Just as he thought of this, the second spear shot out. Gotcha! The flagpole was completely broken, and Maki Fujino saw the flag fluttering high up in air, rapidly falling down. He immediately threw away the broken flagpole in his hand and tried to grab the broken flagpole that still had the flag hanging on it. When all the Japanese students saw this scene, the broken flagpole seemed to be pressing down on their backs, and the pain on their faces deepened. However, this was not the end of their suffering. 3 consecutive bang-bang-bang sounds rang out. 3 bullet holes suddenly appeared in the center of the coordinate flag that was fluttering in the wind. Not only did the Chinese students break their flagpole, but they also used their terrifying shooting skills to shoot 3 bullets at the flag when the broken flagpole fell with the flag. When the Japanese students saw the coordinates flag with 3 bullet holes on it, they burst into tears. Chapter 3722. As the instructor, Hirano Ridge had an ominous premonition when he heard the cries of the students. Before the contest, Li Jinyan had already informed the Japanese instructor, Hirano Ridge, and all the Japanese students of the rules. There were 2 choices for the Japanese students to choose from. Now it seemed that no matter which choice they chose, it would be very disadvantageous for the Japanese. No. It should be said that when Fujino-kun chose to have a rematch, and the loser took the initiative to stand under the flag of the winner and apologize. This choice was even more humiliating than immediately apologizing. It was even more humiliating for the country. It also confirmed that the Chinese students were stronger than the Japanese students. It further highlighted how narrow-minded they were and how they knocked down the Chinese flag out of jealousy. From a moment Fujino-kun made the choice to recontest, they were in an abyss that they could not turn over. The Chinese students above the abyss looked at them as if they were clowns. The Japanese students who were holding the coordinate flag with 3 bullet holes on it cried until they were almost howling. They agreed to compete with the Chinese because they did not want to bow to the Chinese flag. But now, there was no excuse for them anymore. They could no longer find any excuse to escape. In the face of the wailing of his own students, Fujino-kun seemed to have lost all his vitality. He knelt on the ground, and his whole body was so dispirited that his back was bent. Suddenly, he hugged his head and knelt on the ground in extreme pain. Then he pounded the ground with his hands in agony. Again and again, he pounded the ground fiercely. The various emotions that he had no place to express could only be expressed in this way. Under the white light, one could clearly see that his whole body was twitching in pain. If they lost, they had to admit it. If they did not admit it, they would only be embarrassed. At the same time, it would make the Chinese side look more tolerant and magnanimous. Hirano Ridge took a deep breath. At this time, as the instructor, he could not fall. He had to stand up and preside over the situation. Before he finished taking a deep breath, the general of the Monfei military spoke to him coldly in heavily accented English. "Now, please immediately gather the students of your country, put down your country's flag, and bow to the Chinese flag to apologize." As if he did not believe in Hirano Ridge's character, he added very seriously, "This is your own choice. We are all witnesses. You can no longer escape." Also, the Chinese instructors are very tolerant. Whether you lose or they win, they will not release the surveillance video. I think you have one. The Chinese side gave you a choice, so you've already won. If it were any other powerful country, it would be hard to say if the students of Japan would be able to leave this place alive. It sounds like a fair persuasion, but in fact, it can be regarded as a threatening warning. Because Monfei's military officers don't believe in the character of all the contestants from Japan, he has to do this. How could the Flatfield Ridge not know? Therefore, he had to admit defeat. He had to admit defeat. The Japanese students who were standing at the shooting position ran over with joy. They still remembered that after their own student, Fujino-kun, finished shooting, he gave them a victory sign and told them that he would definitely win. Therefore, they all had smiles on their faces as they ran. Even their running steps were so relaxed. But as they ran closer and closer, the smiles on their faces instantly froze when they heard the howls of their own students. They seemed to have realized something, and after a short pause in their running speed, they began to run wildly. Like a gust of wind, they ran closer in the blink of an eye. Chapter 37:23. They were overjoyed because of Maki Fujino's action. They saw Maki Fujino kneeling on the ground in pain, as well as the students from their own country who were howling beside the coordinate flag. Their howling was like a heavy hammer that was swung in midair, smashing into their chests without warning. It smashed into their stiff smiles and slowed down their pace until they could no longer take another step. Why were they crying in pain? Was it because they lost? Lost. Did they lose? The Japanese students who did not dare to take another step forward looked at each other. Fear gradually emerged in their eyes, drowning everyone like a tide. Lost, they lost. They had to choose again, and the result was still they lost. The instructor, Pinji Ling, whistled. His voice was very sharp, and he used so much force that it could break the whistle made of stainless steel. The Japanese students who were one step ahead of Yi Qian and the Chinese students heard the whistle and finally took the step that they did not dare to take. Tianqin couldn't help but whistle. She smiled at Yi Jian and said, "This is so satisfying. This is so satisfying. Now, they will have to obediently bow down to our flag. Oh, and they will have to lower their own flag too. It's so satisfying. There's more to come." Yi Qian, who broke the flagpole that represented the winner and the loser and left 3 bullet holes on the flag, did not let the Japanese off the hook. She lowered her eyes slightly and said coldly, "There's more to come." The Chinese instructor, Li Jinyan, who was also her big brother, said, "The loser's flag is in the winner's request. The loser's flag must be lowered immediately." This sentence was just like a Chinese sentence when spoken in English. Why did they have to compete with the Japanese? It was so that they could dig a deeper hole. Did they really think that they could lower their own flag and lower their heads to apologize to our flag? Wrong. The flagpole was broken and could not be repaired. In that case, the Japanese students had to open their eyes wide and see how the Chinese students would break their flagpole and make their flag fall to the ground. Tianqin and the other Chinese students became even more excited when they heard that there was more to come. They were going to vent their anger in front of the arbitration committee. What other way is there? I really want to know now. Can you tell me? Can you tell me? Tianqin couldn't help asking. She was so excited that she couldn't hide the smile in her eyes. Yi Qian chuckled. "You'll see soon enough. We don't care about scheming, but when it comes to playing, they can only kneel." Sun Tzu's core art of war. The art of war is the art of trickery. If you want to play trickery with the Chinese side, then let's see who can outplay who. At this moment, the Japanese students had finished lining up and were waiting for Yi Qian and the others to return. So the students once again lined up under the national flag and saluted solemnly. Behind them were the Japanese students who were lining up neatly with their heads bowed in apology. They were unwilling, but they had to lower their heads and apologize. The war reporters took pictures of this scene. When the Chinese students returned to China, the pictures were also brought back and kept. After the salute, it was time to lower the sun flag of Japan. Hirano Ridge had an ominous feeling in his heart. When he saw the Chinese female student, Yi Qian, standing in the last row and swinging her gun, his eyelids twitched violently. The Chinese side is definitely going to make some big moves, definitely. Why would they be so kind as to give the Japanese a choice? From the moment they made the choice, it would be the beginning of the Chinese side's revenge. Chapter 3724. Not only was Hirano Ridge's eyelids twitching violently, his heart was also flustered. There must be a conspiracy. There must be a conspiracy. The Chinese side would not destroy the surveillance tape so easily, nor would they erase everything just because they bowed their heads and apologized to the Chinese flag. Hirano Ridge, who was flustered all the way, remained calm on the surface. He arranged for the students to take down the flag. Since it was Fujino Masaki and Fukumoto Rina who caused the trouble, he would let them deal with the aftermath. Thus, Hirano Ridge arranged for the two of them to lower the sun flag. Hirano Ridge also had a small plan for this arrangement. He hoped that the Chinese side would let the two students who caused the trouble lower the Japanese flag because he had already cooperated with them. He hoped that they would not use any other tricks. At this moment, the students who wanted to see their country's flag lowered were all severely suppressed. Everyone's mood was very depressed, and it might even affect tomorrow's competition. The instructor, Hirano Ridge, only hoped that after the flag was lowered, they could immediately rest and not do anything unbearable to the students. Under the humiliated expression of the Japanese students, Fujino Masaki and Fukumoto Rina gritted their teeth and walked with heavy footsteps to the sun flag that was fluttering in the wind. The two stood still and looked at each other, then slightly nodded. They looked like they were about to die. One lowered his head and held the flagpole, while the other lowered his head and pulled down the sun flag. The Japanese students below first looked up at their sun flag. When the flag was lowered, everyone lowered their heads tightly, and tears flowed out from their eyes. The Japanese students, standing in the last row, suddenly heard a voice behind them. When you deliberately hit our country's flag, have you ever thought about the grief and indignation that we as soldiers felt? Using the code of Hammurabi, a passage from the Bible, an I dash for an itich for a dash tooth, we're just using the same method to tell you how we felt at that time. The one who said this was Tianqin. She calmly said the passage from the Bible. The Japanese students who heard it suddenly froze. An eye for an anituch far, a dash, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This was the principle that the Chinese students taught the Japanese to be a human being. Tianqin had originally wanted to say, don't rush to do what you want others to do, but it was a little difficult to translate this into English, so she thought of borrowing this passage from the Code of Hammurabi. Obviously, the Japanese students, whose backs were stiff, understood. The Japanese students, who had their heads lowered, did not notice that when they were about to lower the sun flag, Yi Qian had already raised the rifle in her hand. Hirano Ridge, who had been watching her from the corner of his eye, saw her move and was shocked. His expression was more frightened than ever. He seemed to have thought of something and shouted in his native language, "Please stop." Unfortunately, it was already too late. An eye for an anituch for a tooth, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What it really meant was that if you did something to me, I would do the same to you. Our flag was deliberately broken by you. So your country's flag must be broken too? Do you think you can make up for it by lowering your heads and admitting your mistakes and putting down your national flags? Naive. Now, it was the time to break it off. Even though Hirano Ridge had realized what Yi Qian wanted to do in time, he was powerless to stop Yi Qian's true intentions. He screamed in horror, but Yi Qian, with a cold gaze, fired 3 shots. Chapter 3725. Bang, bang, bang. There was no pause in the middle, and 3 bullets were fired in a calm manner. Maki Fujino, who was holding onto the flagpole, first heard the instructor Hirano Ridge's roar of shock. Then he heard gunshots. Before the other Japanese students could react to the gunshots, Maki Fujino heard a familiar kacha sound from above his head. This sound, his heart skipped a beat, and he looked up at the sky in horror. He saw the Japanese flag, which represented the Japanese nation, falling down with a broken flagpole. No. Seeing his nation's flag falling down in such a manner, Maki Fujino felt as if a large piece of his heart had been dug out. It was so painful that his eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. He opened his arms and tried to catch the falling Japanese flag. Fukumoto Rina's reaction was slightly slower, and before she could look up, the Japanese flag, together with the broken flagpole, fell to the ground beside her feet. Dust flew up, and under the illumination of the snow-white lights, it was as if everything was an illusion. With just a blink of an eye, everything in front of them would be destroyed. The broken flagpole was pressing down on the messy Japanese flag, and Maki Fujino, who opened his arms but failed to catch it, stared blankly at the ground. His kneeling action seemed to be in slow motion. Fukumoto Rina, who finally reacted, was stunned. Broken? The flagpole was broken? In other words, the gunshots that she heard just now were actually the gunshots that broke their flagpole? Who? Who did it? Who did it? Fukumoto Rina, whose eyes were red, roared, "Who did it? Who did it? Get out here! Get out here!" His furious roar woke up all the Japanese students, and the students in the front row had already rushed to the broken flag. It was not an illusion, and the Japanese students did not see wrongly. Their Japanese flag was indeed hit by Yi Qian's 3 bullets, and then it fell to the ground. This was the real, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The scene in front of them made the Chinese students completely vent their anger. If not for the fact that the scene was not suitable for applause, they would have clapped and celebrated. Yi Qian directly used bullets to break the flagpole of the Japanese flag. Ha ha ha, this is so satisfying. The Chinese students had vented their anger, but the Japanese students were furious. Yi Qian put away his rifle, while Li Jinyan stood beside Pinji Ling, who had been angered by the scene in front of him, and said calmly, "This is your own choice. Do you want to act shamelessly again? I'll give you a choice. The loser's flag will be immediately lowered at the request of the winner. I've told you very clearly that the 3 generals of the arbitration committee can testify. You're using this kind of method to ask us to surrender? You are shameless and despicable." Flatfield Ridge could not face this matter calmly. He could not accept such a thing. His rage was met with a cold glare from Li Jinyan. "Mr. Hirano, how did your students break our country's flag? Shameless and despicable. I think that's more suitable for you. Just now, my student said something, and I'll repeat it to you now. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We're just doing the same thing you did to us. In China, this is called reciprocity. I know you can understand Chinese, so don't pretend that you can't understand." The 3 generals of the arbitration committee were actually shocked by the Chinese students' actions. They did not have time to do anything, and the Chinese students had already finished shooting. At this moment, the anger of the Chinese students had subsided, and the angry Japanese students were easy to deal with. After all, they were in the wrong first. Chapter 3726. In the face of the angry Japanese students, the 3 generals of the arbitration committee had a high degree of agreement. After a brief exchange of glances, the senior general of the Monfei military stood up and confirmed that the Chinese instructor had indeed said that. He said in a very serious and solemn tone, "The Chinese instructor did say that, but you didn't ask clearly and immediately agreed. Therefore, you can't blame the Chinese side. You should know that if you won, the Chinese side would bow and apologize to your Sun flag and lower their flag. Now, the Chinese side won, so you have to abide by the rules set before the competition. Who wanted to solve this matter the most? It was undoubtedly the senior general of the Monfei military. He had enough of this kind of trouble caused by jealousy. He really had enough. After the disqualification of Korea, there were a few days of peace. Even if some countries were jealous of the strong Chinese students, they didn't do anything that gave him a headache. He thought that until the end of the competition, there wouldn't be any more incidents like the Korean students. He really thought so. In the end, reality gave him a hard slap in the face. The Japanese students had caused him trouble again, and this trouble was even bigger than the trouble caused by the Korean students. They deliberately broke the Chinese flag and even made up their minds not to admit it. When the most important evidence was produced, they even dared to destroy the evidence. Now, the Chinese side finally stopped pursuing their shameless behavior. But in the end, they were angry because the Chinese side told them how to behave again. Angry my ass. Why do you have to be angry? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The Chinese instructor was right. The Chinese side would naturally treat them the same way they treated the Chinese side. Could it be that only the Chinese side was allowed to swallow their anger and not allow them to get what they deserved? The senior general of the Monfei military was completely on the side of the Chinese side. He was just short of pointing at Hirano Ridge's nose and telling him that he had to accept the Chinese flag and that there were no more conditions for negotiation. Because the Japanese, who were the first to do something shameless, had no right. The words of the senior general of the Monfei military made Hirano Ridge feel that they were being treated differently from the Chinese side. However, he couldn't refute that the Chinese students had shot their flagpole with bullets, but he wanted to regain their dignity by bowing their heads and apologizing to the Chinese flag. Our students have already stood under their Chinese flag and apologized. Now, shouldn't they do the same? The Russian general laughed, as if he had heard a joke. You're mistaken. These are two completely different things. You bowed to the Chinese flag and apologized because you did it on purpose. The Chinese students shot your flagpole because you lost the contest. They did it within the rules of the competition. Therefore, you have no right to ask the Chinese students to apologize to your sun flag. You need to separate the two things clearly. You can't mix them up into one thing. Also, if you want the Chinese side to release the CCTV in the car to let the whole world know about the behavior of the Japanese students, you can continue to pester them. Oh, that's right. I have to remind you that if you continue to pester us, you will be disqualified from the competition. This is not a threat, it's a fact, and we are punishing you based on the facts. Do you still want to continue? Sure. Let's give it a try then. Chapter 37:27. The instructor, Pinji Ling, was completely at a disadvantage. The American general told him, if you still want to compete, you should accept the truth. The truth started from your students' intentional mistakes. You have no reason to absolve yourselves. If I were you, I would use another method to regain my dignity, and not in this kind of situation where you have no reason to absolve yourselves. The Chinese students are just using their actions to tell you that they will treat you the same way you treat them. There is nothing wrong with that. This sentence slowly suppressed the anger in Hirano Ridge's heart. He knew very well that it was indeed his students who were in the wrong first. He also knew very well that it was impossible for the Chinese to stand under their sun flag and admit their mistakes. However, there were some things that had to be tried. Perhaps they could succeed. After the test, the Chinese attitude was completely different from before. It was so strong that it made the Monfei generals who had previously neglected them retreat. It was also so strong that it made the Russian generals praise it. It also made the American generals, who had always been on their side, think that the Chinese did not do anything wrong this time. The whole situation was in favor of the Chinese, and the Japanese had no advantage at all. Therefore, he could only give up and endure the humiliation brought by the Chinese students. I understand. Hirano Ridge nodded unwillingly. He immediately gathered all the students and did not continue to be entangled in this matter. As long as they did not withdraw from the competition, they still had the opportunity to use the most effective way to let the Chinese students know that the Japanese soldiers would not easily bow down. When the Japanese students who were confronting the Chinese students heard the command to gather, the atmosphere was so tense that it was on the verge of exploding. They knew that they had lost this confrontation again. Some of the Japanese students expressed that they were not convinced. They only stopped when Hirano Ridge glared at them. The Chinese students always stood at the front, protecting Yi Qian behind everyone. The Japanese students could not even see the corner of Yi Qian's clothes. Hirano Ridge once again gave the command loudly. The Japanese students who had put away the sun flag angrily had no choice but to give up. After gathering, Hirano Ridge suddenly turned around and walked towards Li Jinyan. His steps were very big, so heavy that every step he took could be heard. Everyone, including the Japanese students, thought that he was going to do something. He stopped a short distance away from the flat ridge so that he could look at Li Jinyan, who was taller than him. Li Jinyan also looked at him indifferently. They only looked at each other, but he didn't ask if there was anything else. No one knew what Hirano Ridge was thinking. After looking at each other for about a minute, he took a deep breath and left with the Japanese students without saying a word. The leaving Japanese scholars glared at the Chinese students with fierce and gloomy eyes, as if they had made an agreement. Among them, Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto's eyes were the most ruthless. They had never expected that in the end, it would not be the Chinese side that would lose their dignity, but themselves. Facing their gazes, the Chinese students calmly watched them leave. "Come, let's fight. I was not afraid of you decades ago, and I will not be afraid of you decades later." Li Jinyan expressed his gratitude to the arbitration committee. When the American general said that he wanted to take back the magnetic disc, Li Jinyan said, "There is no magnetic disc." I showed them this. He took out a black plastic disc the size of a fingernail from his pocket. "A piece of plastic. If you want, I can give it to you." Chapter 3728. It was indeed a piece of black plastic. The American general smiled and said, "No need, it's just a piece of plastic." He raised his hand to look at the time and lowered his head. "It's getting late. Since the matter has been properly resolved, we should leave. I wish you good dreams tonight and continue to have better results tomorrow." Li Jinyan did not stay any longer. With a slight smile on his face, he politely shook hands with the three generals and sent them to the car before returning to the Chinese team. The Chinese students who fought for their dignity could finally rest. When they were eating in the wilderness, some students from other countries came over to ask what had happened. The Japanese students who came back earlier were like hedgehogs, standing up their spikes and eavesdropping on whether the Chinese students would say anything bad about them. Tomorrow's competition was a coordinate competition, so they would continue to sleep in the wilderness tonight. The tents of the students from various countries were built next to each other. Because the areas had already been divided, the tents of the Chinese and Japanese students were very close to each other. If there was any movement between the students from both countries, they would be able to detect each other's movements. Now that the foreign soldiers were asking the Chinese students, the Japanese students who were nearby eavesdropped and even deliberately moved a few steps towards the Chinese side. In the end, the Chinese students did not say anything. Instead, they chatted with the foreign soldiers about what they did not do well in today's competition and successfully changed the topic. The Japanese students eavesdropped for a while and found that the foreign soldiers did not say anything bad about them. Only then did they return to their own tents. Matsumoto Michiko coldly glanced at the three students who were eavesdropping on the Chinese students. Her face was very gloomy. The instructor told us that even if we are standing in front of an enemy we hate, we must be very calm. We must not let ourselves make the first mistake. You should not eavesdrop on what the Chinese students are saying. You should learn from our instructor. He was able to endure when he was at the peak of his anger and walked over to look at the Chinese instructor. What the instructor can do, you should also do. Right now, we are enduring, not having friction with the Chinese side again. The reason why Hirano Ridge suddenly walked over to look at Li Jinyan when he left was to tell the students that if he could endure, the students could also endure. At this moment, the two siblings, Yi Qian and Li Jinyan, were sitting on a small hill not far from the campsite and chatting. Monfei's nights were beautiful. The clear night sky was filled with twinkling stars, and the faint starlight shrouded the wilderness. It was so quiet that just sitting there was a kind of enjoyment. The two siblings started the conversation based on the attitudes of the students from Korea and Japan towards the Chinese students. Li Jinyan talked a lot about how the Chinese students ran into a wall overseas in the 1980s and 1990s. He mentioned that a general had gone to the United States to observe an aircraft carrier. Due to confidentiality, the United States only allowed the general to see a small part of it. Due to the distance, the general wanted to see more and learn more, so he had no choice but to tiptoe to watch. At that time, the Chinese generals had suffered many grievances abroad, but they had swallowed them down. Because China was still in the stage of learning modestly, it was impossible for them to take a strong stance. Now that they had entered the 21st century, China had begun to become stronger, and there was no need to endure some grievances. I'm very happy to see your performance today. In you, I see the strength that our soldiers in the 21st century should have. I don't even need to do much to deal with those who disrespect our country. You have already handled it very well. After returning to China, I will write it in the report and let our country know about the growth of your generation of soldiers. Chapter 37:29. In front of Yi Qian, the usually taciturn Li Jinyan always spoke a lot. Moreover, he was very emotional tonight, so he couldn't help but say a few more words. Tomorrow is the last day of the competition. In order to wash away tonight's humiliation, the Japanese will definitely go all out tomorrow. You guys should be prepared. Don't give them a chance to turn the tables. The relationship between the two countries had always been very delicate. It couldn't be said to be very good, but it wasn't very bad either. However, this time, the relationship between the students of the two countries was very tense. Tomorrow was the last day of the competition. The Japanese students who had been holding back their anger would definitely have a final battle with the Chinese students. And in this battle, there was the possibility of personal attacks. The Fujino family and the Fukumoto family are well-known right-wing families in Japan. They have a lot of hatred for our country. Today, they weren't surprised that the two of them broke our flagpole, but they were surprised by our attitude. As long as they know that our attitude is strong, they will understand that even if they do something, they will still have some reservations. Tomorrow was the orienteering event. They had to find the coordinates in the primeval forest within the specified time. Moreover, they had to carry a weight of 27 kilograms. The difficulty and danger of this was very high. First of all, entering the primeval forest was a danger. Then, they had to carry a weight of 27 kilograms. This was a high level of difficulty. Moreover, finding the coordinates was not an easy task. The coordinates could be at the foot of a mountain or at the top of a mountain. It could also be on top of a rock that needed to be climbed. Entering the primeval forest with a weight of 27 kilograms to find the coordinates, and then returning to the finish line to end the 7 days of the competition. Tomorrow was also the day with the highest score. One coordinate was 1 point. Dozens of coordinates were dozens of points. If one reached the finish line early, 1 point would be added every 5 minutes. These points added up to a considerable amount. It was very likely that those who were close to each other would be overtaken. Until today, the Chinese team was still firmly in 4th place. They had 21 points more than the 5th place and 12 points less than the 3rd place. In other words, the Chinese team could pull down the top 3 and catch up. Li Jinyan didn't make any mandatory requirements. However, if they could overtake the top 3, that would be good. Yi Qian was still very confident about tomorrow's competition. His main concern was to guard against the two right-wing students from Japan. The two siblings did not chat for too long, only about 10 minutes or so before returning to the tent. Zhang Minghong and the others were happily chatting with the foreign troops of several countries. The topics they talked about were related to the competition, as well as the customs of their own countries. The foreign armies did not know much about China. Some of them even thought that China did not even have access to electricity. Only the largest cities had access to electricity. In short, in their eyes, China was as poor as it could be. It was so poor that even the Chinese students found it unbelievable. There was no food to eat, no clothes to wear, no electricity. The Chinese students didn't know whether to laugh or cry when they heard this. There's a gap between the rich and the poor in every country, and it is the same in our country. There are some extremely remote mountain villages that do have some of the problems you mentioned, but it is not like what you said. Although our country was indeed very backward for a long time, our country and our people have been working hard to make progress, Zhang Minghong said with a smile. His words showed the confidence of a Chinese soldier. His English was very good, and he could even quote from the classics. He could make a very ordinary thing seem very lively. Even Yi Qian couldn't help but applaud when he heard this. This was an opportunity for students from other countries to get to know China. Every Chinese student would talk about how good their hometown was. When the time came to leave, the foreign troops present would be full of enthusiasm and say that they must come to China after they retire. Like the Chinese soldiers, they could not go abroad for personal reasons during their military service. Chapter 37:30. During the exchange, the foreign students were all amiable and graceful. Although there was a hint of observation, it was understandable because the Chinese students they were interacting with were also observing them. After the foreign students finished their exchange with the Chinese students, they returned to their tents and sighed with emotion. The more they interacted with the Chinese students, the more they realized that their misunderstanding of the Chinese country was too deep. What their country had, the Chinese also had, and what their country did not have, the Chinese still had. 5,000 years of civilization was like a star in the universe that would never fall, gorgeous and mysterious. It made them, who had never been to the Chinese side, have an impulse to immediately set off to take a look. I'm surprised by their security. In our country, a girl, oh no, even a boy wouldn't dare to walk outside at 2 or 3 in the morning, let alone get drunk and lie on the side of the road. That's really, really dangerous. Your property will be in danger, and your life will be in danger. But the Chinese students told us that it's very common for people to walk alone at 2 or 3 in the morning in their country. There might be robberies, but it's really very rare. Yes, I'm also very surprised, but my father once told me that the Chinese side is a very safe country. It's a country where the police only need an electric baton to patrol the streets. Before I came into contact with the Chinese soldiers, oh, God, I always thought that my father was lying. Now I finally know that my father wasn't lying, but that I knew too little. I think that the reason the Chinese side is able to achieve so much in terms of security is because of their strict control of guns. Their laws prohibit private gun sales. Once caught, they'll be directly arrested and sent to prison without any explanation. I really like this part of them. Because my grandmother was shot to death by a 16-year-old boy with a gun. I still remember when my grandmother died. Oh, sorry, brother, I need to go out for a walk alone and calm down. Go, my good brother. It's all in the past, you know? It's all in the past. The students from the United States stopped talking because a student's grandmother was innocently shot to death. They fell into silence, and no one spoke for a long time. Student from a country in Eastern Europe also talked about the safety of China. They couldn't imagine that a girl could drive through a village road or a highway in the middle of the night. They also couldn't believe that 1 or 2 in the morning could sit by the river or on the street and eat food grilled with charcoal. That night, the foreign troops who had finished their exchanges with the Chinese side returned to their tents to discuss the safety of the Chinese side. Their words were filled with deep amazement. The Japanese students did not join in, but they could hear what the Chinese students were saying to the students from other countries. They also interacted with the students from other countries, but the wariness they showed made it impossible for the conversation to continue for too long. After a while, the conversation would stop, and after a new round of silence, another round of communication would begin. In the end, the foreign troops who originally wanted to communicate with the Japanese students also went to the Chinese side to have a pleasant chat. The Japanese students who were deeply humiliated tonight were not in the mood to communicate with the foreign troops. Almost every student forced a smile and said a few words, then didn't want to say more. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.